I hope everyone can hear me. It sounds like the mic is working. Welcome, my name is Sarah Lawrence. I am the Iris and B. Gerald Cantor Curator in charge of the Department of European Sculpture and Decorative Arts. And I'm so pleased to welcome you to today's special convening around the exhibition Monstrous Beauty, a Feminist Revision of Chinoiserie. Thank you for joining for what promises to be a truly exciting day, bringing together scholars, curators, and artists to discuss the impact of chinoiserie. Today's session will be a timely conversation on the contested histories surrounding chinoiserie, a potential for a more critical look at interior design, and reflections on the impact of beauty standards and aesthetics. The exhibition, curated by Iris Moon, who is Associate Curator in the Department of European Sculpture and Decorative Arts, has received significant critical attention in publications such as Apollo Magazine, the Financial Times, The Guardian, the New York Times, among others, and it's been called an intriguing exhibition with a spectacular display of contemporary ceramics, praised as a refreshing take on the decorative arts, that fascinating and innovative and offers compelling arguments about how we can revise our ideas about women and femininity. We have been thrilled by the outstanding popular and critical reception of the exhibition, and I am delighted that we will be able to reach even broader audiences by sharing today's presentations and conversations online. Bringing together really nearly 200 works of historical contemporary art spanning from 16th century Europe to contemporary installations by Asian and Asian American women artists, the exhibition illuminates chinoiserie through a conceptual framework that brings the past into active dialogue with the present. It is a special delight to have so much of our porcelain on view in the museum within the very innovative framework that makes our collection accessible and deeply interesting to new audiences. Before we begin the day, I want to extend our appreciation for support in making this exhibition possible to the William Randolph Hearst Foundation and the Mellon Foundation, with additional thanks to Kohler Company, the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation, Karen and Samuel Choi, the International Council of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the Edward, John, and Patricia Rosenwald Foundation, and Mimi O. Kim. So without further delay, I'm very pleased now to welcome to the stage the curator of Monstrous Beauties, Iris Moon. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, for that kind introduction, and to all of you for joining us today on this Saturday morning. Before I get started, a little shout out to the Knicks. What a special night. Let's go, New York. We have an incredibly exciting lineup of speakers today, gathered to celebrate a creative convening. Oops, sorry, I'm trying to forward this. Here we go. Gathered to celebrate a creative convening of poetry, conversation, and dialogue around the exhibition Monstrous Beauty, a Feminist Revision of Chinoiserie. Before I introduce the general structure and themes of each session, I wanted to set the scene for today's conversation with some of the ideas that gave shape to the exhibition currently open in the Lehman Wing Galleries of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Monstrous Beauty retells the history of porcelain through a feminist lens by placing historical examples of this lustrous, coveted artificial material that fascinated Europeans when it began arriving on ships from Asia in the 16th century into conversation with contemporary works by Asian and Asian American women artists. Brought to early modern Europe from China on ships laden with fragile and coveted cargo, porcelain ignited an obsession with the exotic. Chinoiserie, the effeminate, ornate style, fed by a demand for foreign luxuries and fantasies of an imaginary Far East, filled countless homes across Europe and later America. The monstrous, a term once used to describe porcelain, is about the unknown. Yet things we fear and do not understand still have the power to captivate us. A central theme of the exhibition looks at the ways in which the language of chinoiserie was mapped onto the Asian woman, investigating how this modern subject was constructed in the Western imagination in tandem with the obsession with exotic, inanimate objects. At first glance, nothing appears more innocuous than the superficial charms of chinoiserie, a beloved style in interior decoration characterized by colorful, ornate, and decorative domestic settings, where once exotic materials are artfully combined with patterned sofas and curtains to create cozy, nostalgic atmospheres that layer exoticism and familiarity in equal measure. For centuries now, the historical style has been a part of the decorative vocabulary of Europe and America, from remote princely palaces to the extravagant interiors created by the late interior designer Mario Boada, once known as the Prince of Chintz. Picture countless interiors covered in ornate wallpaper with peacocks, flora and fauna, gilded mirrors that reflect colorful patterned chintz fabrics decorated with impossible fantasy landscapes of pagodas and temples, glossy black and red lacquer cabinets heightened with gilding, and of course the ubiquitous gloss of blue and white porcelain vases. Superficial, fun, commercial, and decorative, chinoiserie wraps the viewer in the realm of surfaces and patterns, rather than deep philosophical thought. It's a style that lives at the level of the superficial, a language that deflects attention from the human towards the ornamental. Thus, we might easily picture an object such as this reverse-painted mirror, which opens the exhibition in Lehman, as part of the Chinese taste that filled countless interiors in 18th century Europe. In the collections of the Met, the mirror depicts a woman with an assertive look in Manchu dress smoking a pipe, with a porcelain vase full of peonies placed behind her. This genre of the beautiful woman, or meiren, was typically found on the commercial exports decorated in Canton and shipped to Europe in the 18th century. Such a mirror would have been at home in the pavilions that European royalty built in the 18th century, such as the Chinese pavilion in Drottningholm in Sweden, initially a temporary structure built by King Adolf Friedrich for his wife Lovisa Ulrika for her birthday in 1753, and later made permanent in 1763. When I went to visit the pavilion 2 years ago on a cold spring day, amidst the still barren branches of the landscape park, I could see how utterly inviting this warm, colorful, decorative language would have been to royalty in cold, remote Sweden. Room after room in the small pavilion is decorated in colorful greens, reds, and blues, painted with vignettes of fantasy landscapes featuring figures cavorting in exotic dress. One corner room features a series of reverse-painted mirrors, very much like the example at the Met, which line the walls above the marble mantel, filled with Chinese porcelain figurines, set nearby delicate painted beauties on the mirrors. Now, since the palace was closed during the winter months, and I do have a tendency of going a bit off track during tours, I was curious to know what was hiding under the many protective cloths that were placed around the space. So you see them here. Lifting them up revealed painted ceramic seated figures, as well as colorful musicians playing instruments. Unintentionally, these cloths brought to the fore the many human presences lurking under or within chinoiserie's seductive and interlocking surfaces that make you see the ornamental before you see the human. Returning once more to the reverse-painted mirror in the Met's own collection, I locked eyes with the woman in the reflection. It was impossible to ignore her and the other woman next to her. Staring at my own reflection in the mirror, I started to ask myself, how might chinoiserie operate as a framework that traps or ensnares a person within a history against her will? How can we see and be seen otherwise? This calls to mind the powerful work of Asian American artist David Diao, who created the painting, "Pardon Me, Your Chinoiserie Showing," as a sharp and comical response to a French curator who had questioned his authenticity as a real Chinese artist, judging his work based on her own preconceived cultural values. Calling out this history and its prejudices, naming it, framing it, and putting it on the wall, David Diao's painting allows us to see the past in another light and to reclaim it. It's incredibly meaningful and powerful to have the chance to think together about how chinoiserie and the histories of exoticism look different to us today, particularly in the context of AAPI month. One of the events that prompted this exhibition when I began working on it in 2021 was the Atlanta spa shootings, when 8 victims, 6 of whom were women of Asian descent working in the spa industry, were murdered. Reflecting on this traumatic event raised the question of how the histories of exoticism were tied to violence against Asian and Asian American women, an issue raised powerfully in Eileen Kwon's article, Why It's Time to Rethink Chinoiserie. Discussing with the artist Patty Chang about how to meaningfully remember the lives lost in the Atlanta shootings led to the thought-provoking commission piece, Abyssal. Throughout Monstrous Beauty, confronting the past is not always straightforward, linear, or obvious, but prompts at times poetic juxtapositions that question chronologies, and invites a myriad of voices into the museum to change the conversation, including the audio guide created in collaboration with author and musician Michelle Zahner. One purpose of the creative convening today is an invitation to think our way through the strange and unfamiliar, as well as the paradoxes of fantasy, and to consider how perspectival shifts can change the way we see the story. For example, when I first considered including this dragon dress that was once owned by Anime Wong, who was known as a living embodiment of chinoiserie, I thought of it as the epitome of glamour. Yet encountering it laid out on the table evoked a different side to Anime Wong's image and the price of having to live within the constraints of a fantasy projected image. Pairing the dress with Liebel's Fantastic Monster Black in the exhibition provided another way to think about how the monstrous could form a shape of liberation against the strictures of expectation and projections. For today's creative convening, I'll be joined by my colleague Joy Kim in introducing the incredible lineup of participants. We'll open the day with a poetry reading by Sally Wen Mao, followed by the first conversation in session 1, which will address the contested histories of chinoiserie. What are the scholarly stakes involved in rethinking the relationship between past and present, not as linear or chronological, but more multivalent and complex? Next, we will turn to the question of critical design and chinoiserie, which will be moderated by a young No of August Magazine. Can we recuperate chinoiserie's language of curiosity, at the same time pair it with a process of critique? After a break for lunch, session 2 will proceed with an artist conversation led by Howie Chen, who recently curated a fantastic exhibition about Asian American art that asked timely and provocative issues of how belonging and unbelonging are tied to the legacies and pasts of contemporary Asian American art. And given the broad parameters of a creative convening, it's exciting to expand the reach of the conversation beyond art to consider beauty. Our second conversation in the afternoon will consider beauty standards and perhaps even probe the monstrous side of its construction. How is the distorting lens of exoticism still entangled with the expectations we place on beauty? Is beauty skin deep, or is there something more that lurks beneath the surface? Who is beautiful, who is monstrous? And I'm including here a picture of The Substance, which is a film I have not seen yet, but I've been told by people that it gives them strong monstrous beauty vibes, so I sort of included it in the image here. And finally, we will end with a thrilling keynote by Anne Onlin Chang, whose book Ornamentalism has been so instrumental in thinking about many of the themes of the exhibition and in the conversations we'll share with you today. So thank you so much. So I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, who's Sally Wen Mao. And Sally Wen Mao is the author of the story collection 9 Tales, 9 Tales, and the author of 3 collections of poetry, The Kingdom of Surfaces, a finalist for the Maya Angelou Book Prize, Oculus, a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Award, and Mad Honey Symposium. The recipient of an NEA grant, a Cullman Fellowship, and 2 Pushcart Prizes, Mao is an assistant professor of English at Baruch College. Please join me in welcoming Sally Wen Mao.
Hi, Thank you so much for joining us today. So honored to be a part of this, along with so many brilliant scholars, curators, artists. Obviously, this exhibition really resonated with me. I've been writing poems for a while now, and a lot of poems I feel are direct responses to the themes, right? So I'll start with a poem called Occidentalism from my second collection of poetry, Oculus. Occidentalism. A man celebrates erstwhile conquests, his book locked in a silo, still in print. I scribble, make Sharpie lines, deface its text like it defaces me. Outside, grain fields whisper. Marble lions are silent, yet silver-tongued with excellent teeth. In this life, I have worshipped so many lies. Then I workshop them, make them better. An East India Company, an opium trade, a war, a treaty, a concession, an occupation, a man parting the veil, covering a woman's face, his nails prying her lips open. I love the fragility of a porcelain bowl, how easy it is to shatter Chinoiserie, like the Han Dynasty urn Ai Weiwei dropped in 1995. If only recovering the silenced history is as simple as smashing its container, book, bowl, celadon spoon. Such objects cross borders the way our bodies never could. Instead, we're left with history, its blonde dust. That bowl is unbreakable. All its ghosts still shudder through us like small breaths. The tome of hegemony lives on, circulates in our libraries, in our bloodstreams. One day, a girl like me may come across it on a shelf. Pick it up. Read about all the ways her body is a thing. And I won't be there to protect her, to cross the text out and say, go ahead, rewrite this. This poem is a poem called On Porcelain, and it's from my third collection of poetry called The Kingdom of Surfaces, which I think speaks directly to sort of the history of Chinoiserie and of Chinese aesthetics. So this one is called On Porcelain. White fragility is priceless to the empire. Porcelain is stronger, more translucent than earthenware. The Chinese invented porcelain back around 200 BC. Recipe, kaolin, feldspar, and petunse, heated to 2,700 degrees in a jingdezhen kiln, spun in whirls. A porcelain chimera with the head of a serpent and body of a lion sleeps in fire. Don't wake her up. She's a fire-breathing bitch. For millennia, the West has attempted to replicate porcelain and failed. Marco Polo tried to give it a name, porcelana, as he presented a vase to his queen, named for the translucent white cowrie shell, legal tender for the slave trade, a sister word to porcella, little hog, its belly ripe for breeding, for slaughter. After the French soldiers looted Beijing's old summer palace, they presented their spoils to Empress Eugenie. After British soldiers sacked the old summer palace, they presented their spoils to Queen Victoria. When the British Royal Army handed her a stolen Pekingese, their queen named the dog Ludi. Plunder is in the language of naming. On porcelain. My century of humiliation began with my body, To this day, the cliche still stands. A white woman's skin made of porcelain. At 12, I collected porcelain dolls, all with blank European complexions, melancholia and pure velvet capes and gingham, summer dresses, a hot fantasia. I was never taught to wish for the features of these dolls, their rosy cheeks and bright ringlets. I only learned that my face was flat and nothing beautiful, that nothing beautiful can come from my blood, my people. So when my first doll broke, her rosy cheek cracked open, I collected shards, cut my fingers, cried as if my own cheek was sliced open. In 1940s, the Clarks conducted a psychological study, an experiment with dolls and children. Where did these babies learn to hate themselves, they wondered. The value and delicacy of white women so priceless. A white woman's tears enough to burn Troy. In 1955, in Money, Mississippi, a white woman cries, and the cost is a boy, is Emmett, is his mother weeping at his casket. In 2020, in Central Park's North Woods, a white woman feigns distress, calls the cops on a black man, a bird watcher. In this season of migration, murder is in the language of her braying. If a white woman cries, every tear reaps the sentence. My dolls, their cheeks broken, the currency of innocence. On porcelain. The last empress of France, the wife of Napoleon III, opened her Chinese salon in 1863 in the Château de Fontainebleau, home of every French regent, their troves, their treasures. Consider when museums and private collections acquire their objects, how language, like history, neutralizes. Ludi, a dog, acquires a word, forged in amnesia, shrouding provenance. How the news said the cop knelt on a man's neck as if the murderer was saying a little prayer. How protesters looted when stocking supplies. When looting starts, the shooting starts, the then president wrote, as rebellion broke out, the smoke of rubber bullets in their wake. They called this looting a disgrace. But the smoke of the burnt police station remembers the smoke of the burnt schools, remembers the smoke of the bombed out churches, remembers the smoke from rage forged in fire. In Birmingham, in Ferguson, in Tulsa, in Minneapolis, in Louisville, protesters took off the right hand of the King Louis XVI statue. How porcelain never tires of burning. Smoke from Jingdezhen kilns forges our chimera. Noun, a thing hoped for, but in fact is impossible. She awakens. In June 2014, I walked the length of King Louis XVI's chateau, left my fingerprints on his guilt, found her, my cloisonné enamel chimera, inside a vitrine that held my century of humiliation, my looted histories. Then a year later, in the low light, before daybreak, a team of thieves would break into the palace's southwest wing, purloin the chimera, steal her back. On porcelain, the Chinese invented porcelain, Ming blue and white enamels, Persian cobalt oxides, West Lake scenes. Yes, the Chinese have survived centuries in America, exploited, excluded, beaten black and blue, like their Ming vases in an epic of shame, war, revolt, famine, and genocide. Yet, this moment, for the allegiance to capital, or the love of myth, or the fear of an illusion, my Chinese family has forgotten the struggle. They preach law and order. They decry protesters. They defend the blue uniform. They forgot what it means to rail for justice. Maybe they have never known. They do not know how it feels like to mourn a son. They do not want to imagine. They do not dare. They've grown brittle as earthenware, so I am bereft and blue. When I ask, what if it was your son? They kick me out. To Angela Davis, Grace Lee Boggs said, we have colonized material. We have colonized people. We have colonized the earth, the material we've molded into our possession. Kaolin, feldspar, wrangled from earth, a Confucian tradition. To remain insular, to keep fire sealed inside imperial kilns, to quiet each rebellion. But every day in America, I want to fight, bearing a rage my family rejects, cast me out. I do not belong. After a long survival, the immigrant impulse is to forget vulnerability, dismiss the struggle for liberation, cut ties, but nothing, not even porcelain, is shatterproof. And this is the last on porcelain poem. The properties of porcelain, strength, hardness, grit, durability, resilience, long the property of the rich, seal of royals, long plundered, long looted, long lived, long displayed in the pantries of private residences. If the Royal British Army sacks a city, breaks the glass, ransacks treasures, rapes the women, and transports the art to the Buckingham Palace, is this what they mean by civilization? In the Met, a plate with the VOC monogram, the Dutch East India Company, luxury goods on Sotheby's, gourmet tea, colonialism, opium shoved down the throats of the derelict, bodies destroyed over and over for the sanctity of capital. Is this what they mean by peace? Looted Benin bronzes, crackle glazes and celadons, the jade head of a goddess, captive for centuries. Do we dare wish for freedom, a chimera, part tiger, part panther? Mouth, snout, a set of eyes forged from fury always. Another property of porcelain, high resistance to thermal shock, chemical attack. 1 year into the pandemic in Atlanta, a white man shoots, kills 8 people. Most were Asian women he regards not as people, but as temptations. As a policeman, parrots his words to the press. Daily, the people on the streets risk the cold, the tear gas, the pandemic, the police, to ask a nation, do you want to protect people or your property? Ask the cops, who exactly do you serve? Who do you protect? Not the people, but the prisons, the pipelines, the fences. We march for Black liberation, for indigenous land and water. America, we march. An uprising. To vitrify is to transform. We become the chimera, forged in fire, some of a long summer, long simmer, long rage. Dear chimera, tonight we dream. Thank you.
My name is Joy Kim, and I assisted with research for this exhibition. And it is my pleasure to introduce the next group of speakers for a roundtable discussion. First, we have Michael K. Chen, who is a New York-based architect and a principal of MKCA. His work encompasses the design of buildings, interiors, and furniture with a focus on materiality, craft, and collaboration. Michael and the work of MKCA have been widely recognized in press and honored with numerous awards for design excellence, research, and contribution to the public good. MKCA partners with a diverse range of clients and across the US and internationally. And next we have Eileen Kwon. Eileen Kwon is a writer, editor, and creative director based in New York. With a focus on design and culture, she has contributed widely to outlets including the New York Times, CNN Style, and was previously an editor at Dwell, Surface, August Journal, The Slowdown, and The Fast Company. She's the co-author of 2180, a collective oral histories with 20th century design legends, published in 2016 by Princeton Architectural Press. This panel will be moderated by Young No, who is the founder and editor-in-chief of August, a journal dedicated to travel and design. He's also a publisher of August Editions, a bespoke series of books on historical and contemporary visual culture. He is currently working on a book titled Knife, Fork, Spoon, a Modernist Cutlery 1900 to 2025, to be published in the spring of 2026. Please welcome Michael, Eileen, and Young.
Thank you so much, Joy, for that introduction, and thank you to Iris and the Met for inviting us to be part of this incredible convening. I love that term. We're humbled to be here, and we're humble and maybe overwhelmed to be asked to speak about chinoiserie in interior design. That's a huge topic, and so instead of, when we had a call to say, what are we going to talk about? We decided instead of talking about chinoiserie holistically, we're going to break it down through 5 objects or 5 subjects in which then we can kind of work through our thinking about chinoiserie. So that's what you're going to see is sort of 5 themes. But before we do that, we do want to acknowledge this article here that Ali wrote in 2021 called It's Time to Rethink Chinoiserie, which is the theme of the panel as well. So I'm just going to ask Eileen to quickly speak about the article and what your aims were for this piece.
Sure, yeah. I mean, it's such an honor to be here. Thank you again to Iris and the Met for inviting us to revisit this conversation we shared almost exactly 4 years ago, I think. In reflecting back on that piece, I'm reminded of how volatile and charged a time it was in 2021. For various reasons, you know, we were in the thick of the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement. There was an all-time high of scapegoating and hate crimes that were targeting Asian Americans of all ages and cultures. It was sort of a rude reminder, awakening that in this country, sometimes many people still see us as a monolith and can't tell us apart. That was very much tied to the violence we were experiencing. At the same time, there was a significant resurgence in the popularity of chinoiserie among a younger generation that were embracing this sort of, you know, quote unquote traditional nostalgic style. And I think there was just so much to unpack that wasn't being covered in the mainstream design media that I was very critical and interested in sort of poking at. Again, this idea of nostalgia, I think the last few election cycles here in the US had made me aware and wary of how nostalgia was not a neutral, fuzzy sort of device in design and in politics, right? It's something that could bring comfort to some and yet totally alienate others. And that seemed, I think, really core to how I felt about chinoiserie. I do want to say, of course, the article would have never happened if it wasn't actively invited by Assad Serket, who was the editor-in-chief of Elle Decor at the time and the first Black editor of the magazine. And he had started his tenure, his first cover issue, with a huge sort of invitation and announcement to bring more diverse perspectives that were desperately needed in interior design. So this cover here is from March 2021, a month before he and his team reached out to me to write this piece. And for this cover, he invited artist Rachel Baker to redraw and reimagine this very famous yellow room by celebrated American decorator Nancy Lancaster. This room is often referenced as a quintessential example of a British interior. And powerfully, the artist had removed 2 blackamoor furnishings in her rendering and instead placed a Black woman at the center to sort of contemplate her surroundings. That was such a huge, impactful moment for our little circle that we call the design industry. And, you know, as difficult of an assignment as this was to tackle this long, winding, complicated genre that we call chinoiserie that's still around us today, seeing this cover, I think, really emboldened me to take on that challenge.
Right.
And, you know, led to such wonderful conversations with both of you and Iris for that piece, several others in the Asian American design industry. And
I do want to disclose that
Yeah.
you interviewed both Michael and myself, as well as
We
Iris,
did.
for the article. And I think this is the reason why we're here. So thank you very much for that.
Yes, thank you.
no, thank you. I think both of you and Iris and everyone I spoke to for the article really sort of validated these feelings I felt maybe privately, and maybe we wouldn't have spoken out due to the professional risk involved for whatever reason. But you know, this moment in time really demanded a closer reading in a way that hadn't really been discussed in mainstream media.
Well, and it was such an extraordinary piece to be a part of, but also to read, because this kind of discourse was something that was incredibly rare, continues to be incredibly rare in our discipline, right? That interior design is something that exists adjacent to the decorative arts, it exists adjacent to architecture, and it has a really rich disciplinary history, but it doesn't have much of a discourse within itself, right? And so there are these kind of reflective conversations that are happening, but they happen kind of between colleagues, right? Not in the setting of one of the major glossy publications. And so really, you know, it was such a bold sort of time, you know, and kind of a bold move by Assad to open up the publication for that kind of conversation, and something that I think that we're hoping that there will be much more of.
For sure, and we're here. The Met is one of the biggest platforms to kind of disseminate ideas of this kind, so we're very thrilled to be here. But let's go ahead and get nostalgic. Let's go back to mid-1700s here. So you're seeing 4 images of Western depictions of chinoiserie in its largest form, which is in the architecture and the interior itself. Mostly, as previously discussed in the last panel, in the sense, in the form of the folly or the pavilion. Michael, as an architect, can you want to kind of take the lead on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are 2 examples here. One is the pagoda at Kew Gardens, Kew Palace at the time, and the other is a rendering of the Chinese pavilion at Drottningholm that Iris spoke about in her intro. I think both really interesting and kind of compelling examples of chinoiserie, particularly in the context of its emergence kind of around global trade routes. You know, there are buildings that are manifested at a moment when European powers are kind of exerting a lot of mastery over global trade, and so they in many ways signify both to the public, in the case of the pagoda, you know, kind of visible, one of the tallest structures in Britain at the time when it was built, and kind of Drottningholm, like the Chinese pavilion was built as a prefabricated building. It's almost a kind of product unto itself, completely kitted out with sort of actual Chinese things and sort of reproduction Chinese things. That kind of comes with costumes. It's a birthday present, right? Like it's a kind of bauble, but sort of really written into the built environment and kind of powerful way, and then also in the way in which they're positioned within landscapes, that they're kind of these romantic or kind of seductive objects that sort of organize your experience of a park or a garden, the object that is near, the object that is distant, and they kind of house within them all of these sort of occupations of pleasure, right? Kind of drinking tea, taking baths, like this sort of thing.
Yeah, for me, the rise of architectural follies in 18th century Europe are sort of directly tied to this projection of fantasy for faraway lands, for the colonies. As it pertains to chinoiserie, that often surfaces in pagoda imagery, which in our present day has trickled down to shape something as ubiquitous as a gazebo in a garden, right? That's sort of directly influenced by these structures. But we see other motifs from other colonies also play into follies. We see Indian palaces, Japanese bridges, classical ruins, often built at a slightly smaller scale so that they appear further than they actually are, yet are still sort of within reach for the taking. So there's a bit of a dark side to this fanciful idea of a folly.
Diminutive thing
Right.
of the object. As alluded by the last panel, Chinoiserie has always been considered to be a minor genre, right? It's something that you don't use, an aesthetic language that you don't use, let's say, in the throne room or in the state room of these palaces. There are often a pavilion that is used in the summer only, that is used for pleasure only. Would either of you care to comment on that particular aspect of the diminution of a whole culture?
Yeah, I mean, I think it sort of stands in contrast to the classical language that belongs in those more proper rooms, right? And I think it, in many ways, it also speaks something. It speaks a little bit about kind of the context where these objects are created and sort of who they're largely for, right? The other thing, of course, that comes bundled with chinoiserie is that it's often deployed in a domestic environment. It's associated with the spaces of domesticity, of kind of domestic pleasure, of private pleasure, and those are spaces that are often associated with women, right? They're kind of the presence of craft, which is something that is unauthored, vernacular, kind of produced rather than authored, right? Like those kinds of dualities they persist into kind of our present day context in the same way. Part of the reason why I think interior design doesn't possess or kind of doesn't exercise a sort of a rich tradition of discourse is because that discursive kind of conversation, the kind of critical conversation is, this is the province of architecture, right? But it rarely happens in the realm of kind of decoration, right? Decoration is secondary, it's frivolous, and so those
Women's work.
Yeah, exactly, and I think like there's something both sort of diminishing, as we're saying, like about that positioning, and also kind of interestingly liberating, right? Because then there's room to sort of remix, to kind of reconsider, to kind of recontextualize some of these spaces and actors.
Totally. I would say interiors and the domesticity, the feminization of these spaces is always sort of placed or seen as regarded as secondary to the more masculine arts of like sculpture, painting. But in terms of interior design discourse, I feel like so much of it centers around, we hear a lot about designing for the five senses, how a space feels not only physically, but emotionally, right? And so I'm curious to hear how you guys feel looking at some of these very elaborate spaces. Do you feel welcomed?
My thinking about chinoiserie has changed so much since 2021. I honestly never really thought about it too critically. And when you interview me, I do remember saying that for me, chinoiserie, or the kind of chinoiserie I know or knew, is kind of like chop suey, in the sense that it was an imitation of, but made in the Western mode rather than in not native to sort of its origins and so forth. And, you know, obviously there's, it's much more complicated than that. But when I go to these palaces, I'm amused by it. I don't think I'm threatened by it. But that's, I think we can have that discussion of discomfort a little later on. But for me, it's reverse exoticism in a weird way, meaning like I was like, oh, is that how they see us, or is that how they saw it? So,
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm a first generation Chinese American, but my family kind of arrived in this country. My parents arrived in this country in the 60s when late 60s when the immigration laws were changed. But we kind of came from China originally through Taiwan, through successive revolutions. And so, you know, as a kind of individual, I'm also highly estranged from these objects. Like, I have no personal kind of or familial connection to them. Our family possessed these things and they were dispossessed of them. And so in the same way, right, like it's kind of like the recovery of one's own heritage through the examination of through the kind of, through that heritage being kind of fed back to you through a Eurocentric lens is also kind of very, I don't know, it's a kind of second estrangement.
Disembodying,
right.
yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. They're just very odd.
Yeah.
There's this sort of dominant narrative, right, in the dominant Eurocentric narrative that, like, it's almost like the distancing is exaggerated as a line of defense, right? Like, oh, don't worry, it actually has nothing to do with Chinese or Asian culture, but that in itself can be problematic and a form of erasure, right?
Oh,
to say that these objects which bear a likeness to our ancestors' arts have nothing to do with us, and yet embody our likeness in some obscure way. I mean, we all come from different ethnic backgrounds, Vietnamese, Chinese, Korean, and yet we all have a stake in this because our likeness, the likeness of our ancestors, is directly tied to these objects.
Right. And I mean, that likeness is kind of bound up in some of these interiors. These are images of the interior of another Chinese pavilion, the Pagodenburg, the Nymphenburg Palace in Munich. Kind of the ground floor is the blue and white Delft room, and then the Chinese salon is up above. And these are kind of, again, it's sort of like, it's like a second or third generation or second or third iteration of the same material. The blue and white tile is Delft tile in this case, but it's sort of loaded with imagery of Asian gods and goddesses, right? In hats sitting on dragons. And then the second floor salon is also kind of made up of chopped up lacquer work, some of which is European in origin, some of which is Chinese in origin, but it's kind of used as raw material to sort of reassembled into this environment along with these back painted mirrors. And I think it's such an interesting example of the way in which the original material is kind of emptied of its cultural meaning, and then it's sort of harvested for parts or kind of harvested for affect, which is, I think that the other thing that's kind of super interesting about this particular building is it is a Rococo building. Like, from the outside, it doesn't look Chinese until you get inside, right? And so it's somehow like the kind of denaturing of the subject matter and kind of it's kind of decoupling from its original meaning or kind of readings is somehow reinforced by the fact that it appears within a kind of Western building, you know, as a kind of decorative.
It's been applied
system.
rather than built,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
So this idea of the empire of surfaces rather than of structures, as
right.
was mentioned earlier by Sally, as well as the last panel. I do want to move on to the next subject, which is wallpaper, because I think it does bring up a lot of the themes that we're actually speaking right now. This idea of integration or maybe Frankensteining cultures together. So what's interesting is, of course, wallpaper is not a native Asian product. We don't use wallpaper in Asia culturally, you know, at the time. So it was something that was especially made for the export market. and often using an existing template, the toit, as the highly figural, highly visual surface as a template on which then another theme is applied onto. And then that is literally, wallpaper onto a surface that may not have anything to do with the structure, has nothing to do with the subject matter of the wallpaper itself. But there are things, again, of reclaiming or of subversiveness here. And Eileen, you wanted to speak about the larger piece here on the right, from the Cooper Hewitt.
Wallpaper is such an interesting surface because you tend to think of it as sort of just benign and in the background, something that's not meant to be looked at too closely. But in fact, when you do look closely, it can harbor a lot of problematic imagery that romanticizes this colonial imperialist period. So this example on the right that we see enlarged is by a French manufacturer named Jean-Baptiste Réveillon. And famously, he designed wallpapers of all kinds for the bourgeoisie. Marie Antoinette was famously a client of his, who then became a main sort of point of advertising for a wider customer base. And so in this example, I just think it's so fascinating and also just a little bit chilling and unsettling. We see a pairing of a woman enjoying a rather pastoral, leisurely space in a cottage surrounded by sheep. Could that be Marie Antoinette herself at her Petite Trianon, getaway? Perhaps. And then below that, we see images of a colonial conquest in action. The one on the left appears vaguely to be Chinese or Asian. Those terms and visuals were used interchangeably during this time. So I think it's a really great example that reflects the social and political mores of the time. Of course, the conquest, the extraction of luxury goods, and the enjoyment of leisure back home by the domestic female was directly linked and shown here, which is just incredible.
Is this wallpaper the wallpaper equivalent of Luli the dog was mentioned earlier?
I think it is, yes. I feel bad for Ludi. I actually read that Ludi, the dog, I'm really glad that Sally mentioned it in her poetry. I read that the dog was also discriminated against by the other dogs in Britain. So even the dog did not have a good time once it was transported and extracted to Europe.
I mean, the wallpaper is also so interesting because of its, kind of the origins, which are these kind of multi-panel Chinese narrative paintings or kind of landscape paintings, the sort of scenography, the migration of kind of that garden landscape into the interior. And then, like so many things of the period, it was super expensive. It took a very long time to produce, and so the sort of anxiety producing its own kind of domestic or kind of a cottage industry in Europe of sort of recreating these things. I mean, the catalog to the exhibition has these extraordinary examples of really crude, versions of the first European examples of kind of Chinese paper, but that arc of it sort of spawning then a domestic industry and kind of the sort of remixing of imagery and themes, and then it falling almost kind of very quickly, like kind of falling out of favor, right? Like it was then associated with sort of kind of nouveau taste, right? Kind of like overly feminine, overly decorative, right? Like at odds with the kind of classical ideals that so much European design is kind of organized around, and then sort of like its rediscovery later on is some other thing to be kind of nostalgic for. I think it's also super interesting.
Yeah, I think these all over repeat patterns as well is a space contemporarily that we see a lot of problematic imagery still being sort of snuck in there, or maybe it's overlooked. But it's persistent.
It's a bit of where is racist Waldo, maybe?
Exactly. But I think, this example on the right is so interesting. It's almost more insidious when the message is sort of subliminal and subtle. The effect of all over wallpaper is decorative, but it can also be overwhelming, right? You don't know how much of that imagery you're absorbing in your mind and how it might be shaping your outlook on certain cultures or landscapes, places, locations.
Well, and it's also, I think it's something that kind of exists as a thread running through the examples that we selected to talk about, as well as the kind of the convening as a whole, right? Like the beauty also kind of masks something, right? It gives you something else to enjoy, and it's not really the sugar coating for the racist imagery, or the racist content, but it's sort of like the two are kind of bound up in each other in a really peculiar and insidious way.
When we had the call about this panel, we said we're not going to be policing, what's correct or what's incorrect. But I do want to ask, 2025, is wallpaper in general okay? And is pictorial wallpaper with certain themes, is that okay?
There's so much wallpaper that it's hard to overgeneralize. Yes, it's hard.
We didn't include it, but there are examples of contemporary tour where it's like a scene of Brooklyn, with hipsters and so forth. Is that okay? Just as New Yorkers, can you say? Right?
I think rather than sort of focusing on whether something should be canceled or not, or is problematic or not, we should see these as really social, historical artifacts, right? That represent a time. And if you think about the scope of European colonial imperialism, at its peak, 84% of the world's landmass was colonized. And so we are going to run into uncomfortable histories all the time. We can't cancel all of it because it's painful or inconvenient. We need to use those as sort of lessons, understanding how we lived in the past, viewed each other in the past, and use that in a productive way.
Yeah.
Right. I also think, Iris and her really marvelous introduction to the catalog also kind of cited Donna Haraway and kind of talked about sort of the diffractive lens, right? Like, and sort of not taking these objects kind of almost in the manner in which they're offered, which is as a kind of glossy surface, right? A flattened thing, but also but to kind of allow their uneven and kind of diverse sort of bodies of content to kind of emerge and be reconsidered. And I think that this is also something that is such a component to kind of interior design thinking, right? The sort of the conversation or the conversation between objects, their potency relative to one another, the kind of this, like every interior is a form of set theory. It's, I think is really interesting. And so, we also said that we were not here to be like your Asian friend who tells you that something's okay or not okay.
That's not enough research.
That's not right. So I think with all of these things, it's sort of like proceed with, if not caution, then at least proceed with context.
Yeah.
And curiosity.
Yeah. So speaking of flattening or not flattening, respatializing, I want to move on to the next topic, which is the screen, the Chinese screen. So we didn't have wallpaper as a product or as a cultural artifact, but we did have pictorial screens. And so Michael really wanted to speak about, and I agree 100%, Coco Chanel's apartment. Chanel was a major collector of the Coromandel screen, as they were called. She had 38 sets, I believe, or 32, of which 8 she deployed in her apartment, which is above her atelier. Michael, why is this of interest to you, other than being super fabulous?
I mean, it's super fabulous,
Yeah.
right? This is indisputable in a lot of ways. I mean, I think the presence of the screen. I mean, first of all, the name Coromandel, it kind of derives from its point of export, right? Like,
can you give us a little more history on that?
Yeah, I mean, like, so these are lacquer objects. Asian lacquer is obviously, maybe not obviously, Asian lacquer is a material. It's actually a kind of a thin coating of sap from a lacquer tree. It's something that, like porcelain, the Europeans really struggled to create. And there was actually a technique called Japanning, which is sort of like a HGTV decoupage, like,
the poor man's version.
18th century.
It was varnish rather than
Right,
actual
with varnish, and so it's it's cutouts of drawings varnished onto objects, and so that's the Euro kind of poor man's version of lacquer as a material, but it's incredibly laborious, and of course its materiality, its material system, and often, particularly in the case of the screens that Coco Chanel collected, this one in the salon is it's a view of the West Lake in Hangzhou. In China, it kind of has bridges and fishermen and sort of these. It's a kind of series of pastoral scenes that are executed in lacquer and mahogany and silver, mother of pearl, like kind of other precious materials are sort of embedded in that. And as a kind of composite material system, is also so much bound up, particularly in the setting. These photos by Francois Allard, right? Like in the setting is so kind of bound up in a conception of luxury and kind of like that China is always opulence, right? China is always ancient. And just thinking about its presence in an environment that's now been repurposed as the Chanel Haute Couture Atelier, right? Like, still to this day is kind of speaks to its enduring status as something that connotes luxury, and kind of like our conception of luxury, right? Which of course is a sort of like ultra reductive, and kind of and also tied to the exotification of sort of Asian materials and Asian women, right? Like they're bodily as well as objecty, which I think is so interesting.
It's interesting because the Coromandel screens are sort of a footnote to Chanel's legacy and not the other way around,
Right.
even though the Chinese screen has existed for centuries and centuries, right? It's an ancient form that is still completely modern in its use and function. I wanted to return to the terms Coromandel and Japanning. So Coromandel is off the coast of India, and Japan obviously is a wholly different country. And that's one of the things I was really interested in sort of taking apart as a writer is the words, the phrasing that we use when we talk about chinoiserie. Chinoiserie itself has sort of a double gaze baked into it, right? It being French lends it this air of luxury. And chinoiserie itself means, it's sort of an approximation of Chinese, right? Literally translated, it means Chinese-esque, Chinese-ish. It's an intentionally loose and baggy term, which is ironic in the context.
Pejorative term.
Pejorative, yes, and sort of ironic in the context of French lexicon because they have hyper-specific words like champagne is only champagne if it's grown in the Champagne region. Haute couture has to be sort of qualified by a board of experts, and yet chinoiserie has continued to be used in this sort of disrespectfully loose and vague way throughout years, even still today. So,
Although I did read that the term chinoiserie was officially entered into the Académie Française Dictionnaire in 1788, which is the year before the revolution. This idea that chinoiserie existed as something that's it's all pleasure driven in the time of revolution, I think is super interesting and probably adds to its reading of being something that is slightly unhealthy as well. But for me, the what's so interesting about the Chanel apartment with the screens is that there is an intention of how they are deployed. So if you go back to the previous slide here, on the lower left, there's a room by Robert Adam, the great 18th century British architect and interior designer, using parts and panels of the screen as a flat surface, right? Chanel did that. One room, she did sort of line the wall with it, but in other spaces, she used it as it's unfolding in a certain way. And for me, I don't believe there's been serious scholarship on this, but I always tie it to her Chinese screen apartment on the top floor with the floor below, which is this image of this staircase, mirrored staircase that curves. Chanel was actually quite versed and influenced by Cubism. Picasso and Chanel were actually good friends. They collaborated and so forth. So whether it was done on purpose or not, there is this idea of the unfolding of space, that the screens sort of give rise to then this mirror staircase, which then talks about reflection, transparency, simultaneity, all these very modernist preoccupations in terms of creating space, right? And so for me, the kind of logical conclusion is here with these three screens in progression. On the left is Jean Dunant, who was Eileen Gray's teacher with design as well as in lacquering, actually. And then this middle screen is by Eileen Gray from the early 20s, where she is starting to explore the idea of breaking space, of folding space, through not just through using it on a six-panel screen, but through the visual sort of, the abstract pictorial space on the screen. And then, of course, the super iconic black screen here that we see, which she also produced in Chinese red, if I can use that term, which is quite beautiful. But where it's not just the idea of breaking space, but breaking it in multiple directions. So you're getting this highly cubistic kind of view of it. And my feeling is that here is where an originally Chinese chinoiserie product has been transformed. And I just want to ask you guys about that. Like, if we are going to police this, is this the way to do it? Is this the path to pay homage rather than appropriating?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting line. I mean, I think it's a way. It's certainly I think learning from and kind of fueling the invention of something else, right? I mean, I know that there isn't a direct line between modes of Asian dress and Chanel's fashion project, but if one considers sort of the way in which we live with the legacy of what she did, right? The kind of the doing away of the vestigial 19th century modes of dress, the corseting, the boning, right? Kind of like the more abstract language, the more abstract silhouette, the kind of like the figure of a liberated woman is also kind of a little bit bound up in kind of modes of Asian dress, right? The kind of the figure of the qipao, like,
the column dress,
exactly,
the very straight body
right?
dress,
Like, and so, and I think like those two things are in a way related to one another. You can have at somewhere as one layer a deep study of a material system, a kind of a series of techniques, a kind of a spatial idea, and kind of incorporate it into another thought. Like I think that is, we can't avoid these objects, right? We can't unmake their historic presence in the context in which we live in. We have to do something with them. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that this is a really respectful and kind of, genuinely inventive
Mhm.
thing that has been produced.
Which brings us to the next object, the Chinese chair. Another object that has inspired countless variations in the West. Right? Eileen, this is your topic.
Yeah, I mean, this is not a clear through line. It's just sort of a sampling of the large influence of what we see, the Ming Dynasty era chair on the far left. I think this is an interesting example because when we think of chinoiserie or we see chinoiserie featured in a magazine or on social media style blog, for some reason chairs aren't a huge part of that discussion. You know, there's a lot of focus on the ornamental surfaces we showed earlier, wallpaper, the screens, certainly porcelain with all of its imagery and ornamentation. But I think this is such an interesting example because we have this old 17th century chair that's still completely modern and hasn't changed all that much through time, right? The following examples are Hans Wegner, who is seen as a Danish icon of modern design and was inspired to iterate on the China chair, what he called the China chair, after seeing a photo of Danish merchants seated in Ming chairs. So there's a direct line of reference there. I think fans of Wegner will know that origin story, but it's not necessarily hidden, but it's not really spoken about a lot, which is interesting. And of course, what came after this was the wishbone chair, which is seen as a Danish icon, but borrows a lot from this Ming form. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean I think it's so related to kind of the Eileen Gray example, right? Because especially in the figure of Hans Wegner, you know, like that Ming chair was produced in part because of joinery techniques that enabled the production of a continuous curved surface out of solid wood, and that is a kind of technical invention that Wegner sort of grabbed onto, you know, and so I think what's so interesting about that example of the Chinese chair is also how it works across scale, you know, that the detail, the joinery kind of technique, which is then bundled with other vernacular techniques, the shaker, the Windsor chair, you know, the kind of techniques of finger jointing, of spoke wheel shaving, right? Like these other forms of manipulation, you can sort of track that line all the way to the form, the global form of the chair. So it's not just about the shape, although the shape is part of a kind of another language of wholeness, right? That kind of comes out of the Ming chair, but it also takes that Ming chair out of the realm of its ceremonial purpose, which is sort of like how they were developed, and kind of puts it into a context where it can be mass-produced, you know, at great expense, and sort of it's still a special object, but it's designed for kind of repetitive production. It's designed to kind of reappear again in many different environments. And then there's a body, right? Like the reason why it has that chair, that shape, is because it holds your body in a very particular way, in an upright way. It allows your arms to be at your side in a kind of comfortable manner. And so it's like much in the way that the earlier examples that we're talking about, there's this sort of specter of the body, of a kind of an ultra romanticized or exoticized Asian woman. Like here, there is sort of like a reworking of something that actually holds an actual body.
Yeah, I'm very interested in the two examples on the right as well, which are very contemporary and really recognize the Ming chair for its technological advancement in craft, right? And
so just to give a little context, so the Hans Wegner Chinese chair is from 1944, and it's still made in Denmark. And then the third chair is by Xiao Fan, a Chinese artist, and this is from 2000. It's actually here in the collection of Met. And then the last chair is Philip Stark from 2010. So can you speak to the two things? I mean, for me, it's so interesting. we're definitely saying there's no progression here. We just put these 4 chairs together. So the Chalfant chair is not coming from the Hans Wagner chair in any way, but there is a reinterpretation here. Is that for you, Eileen? Is that reinterpretation kind of this double lens? Like, did it go through the European eyes first and then go back to Asia, or no?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, this isn't a chronological line, as you say. They all take inspiration from the Ming chair in some way. I think for me, it's a reminder that every new design object is in dialogue with what came before it, right? It might not be a linear game of telephone or Chinese whispers, as it's called in the UK. But there is a reverence for the advancement of that craft, right? In the exploration of these different materials. But I'm interested in sort of like, why isn't this iconic, influential chair mentioned much in chinoiserie, in style magazines, right? Is it not exotic enough? Is the surface not decorated enough? Is it not, is it not fantastical enough to be considered chinoiserie? I would argue this definitely is chinoiserie.
Okay. And you're okay with the Philip Stark chair?
It depends how much you love his designs.
Yeah.
I think there's nothing on the nose that's offensive about this plastic version. But again, if you dig deeper, it was launched as part of a collection that also included a red garden stool in the shape of a Buddha head, disembodied. So the exoticism was still there, maybe not in this particular piece,
Right.
but definitely present in his creative approach,
Yeah.
I would say.
Yeah. And 2010, that's kind of just yesterday. So that brings us to the last object. You didn't think we were going to let you off easy, right? So, we just did this screen and a chair, so 2 sort of higher end products conceptually as well as monetarily in the interior design world. We do want to touch on the other end, the more kitschy, the lower price, the kind of like the very stretch out kind of references and so forth. So above, there's 3 examples. If you actually just go to Etsy and you type in, chinoiserie kitsch, this is what you get. And then there's this product that is by Stefano Giovannani from, what year is it, 2001. Eileen, also, this is something you want to talk about.
I both love and hate this example because I think it really demonstrates the complexity and sort of defies any sort of simplistic narrative of bad or good when it comes to chinoiserie. So obviously when you look at it, it's an offensive caricature, right? We can consider this part of the afterlives of the long line of pictorial caricatures we've seen on porcelain and other surfaces, wallpaper, et cetera. At first, it's such a reduced caricature, right? What we're really responding to is a set of simplistic shapes and 2 slant eyes. Of course, it's what those shapes evoke that is problematic, right? Yeah. There's a classist aspect to it in that it's evoking the image of a coolie laborer. Of course, the eyes are the only facial feature you see. And then in terms of it having a function, this is called the Mandarin juicer, by the way, which in itself is a little shocking. In recent years, the right-wing politicians have used Mandarin as a slur to refer to just Asian Americans unilaterally.
Wow, okay.
So there's the branding marketing aspect of it.
Yeah.
But then when it comes to the functional use, there's like this embedded violence in it, right? You have to rip the hat off, you have to invert it, you have to smash a citrus into his head while gripping the body with your other hand. And so this did not do well in the US market.
Well,
but there's a plot twist.
There is a plot twist, and I just want to say that the earlier panel, one of the speakers spoke about generative discomfort, and I was like, "Oh, you mean cringe? This is so cringy." But there's a plot twist.
Yeah, the plot twist is that this was commissioned by the National Palace Museum in Taipei for its gift shop. And while this was yanked off of shelves pretty quickly in the US, it sold very well in Taipei. And I think that really highlights the marked differences in our lived experiences, Asian Americans living as minorities in a pluralistic society, and all of the tensions and difficulties, but also beautiful exchanges, right, that can result from that plurality. Whereas, to an audience in Taipei that has access to their cultural treasures, is taught their history, maybe the addition of this one caricature to their, widespread knowledge of their own heritage, maybe it's not as offensive. But here in the US, in public schools, we don't learn about Asian history.
Yeah.
What we get is this on the shelf. And so connecting the dots is a bit harder, I think, from the American gaze. Even though we have a shared heritage, there's just so many differences.
There's also kind of another sort of chinoiseristic dimension to this, which is kind of the replacement of beauty and kind of luxuriousness with cute, right? Like, and the kind of the cute does the same thing that the beauty does. It masks it complexifies the caricature in a way, and instead of it making it covetable, it makes it lovable, which I think is also kind of this really insidious, but also kind of completely fascinating thing. It's like in the same way that the wallpaper is moderately discomforting. This object is doing the very same thing because its aesthetics are so kind of highly optimized for around kind of ideas about desire, and it doesn't take away the fact that caricature and injury are
Right.
like there's a hotline, right? Like between one and the other, but it does make it really complex, and I think it kind of like its reading is so much bound up in the context where we receive the object.
For
right?
sure.
Like we live in a place where these traits, the buck teeth, the slanty eyes, right, like have historically been used to incite violence, like against people who look like us. And in an Asian audience, somehow the cuteness can kind of like override that, or it becomes bound up in another kind of cultural stream, you know.
So, your point about different standards of beauty is interesting. I believe that's a panel this afternoon. But I do want, and I also want to say that was the genesis of the Hans Wagner Chair, was that he was super intrigued with a different proportioning system of the chair back to the chair arm to the chair legs that's very different than the Danish system, which is considered to be the epitome of Western furniture making. And that's super interesting. And how you sit on that, as you said, how is either disembodying or embodying the user in that way. But I want to just go back to the fact that, this product was commissioned by a major, very serious museum of Chinese art in Taipei, and that it sold very well. So obviously, the viewer, the purchase, the consumer did not see so-called cringiness in this. They didn't see danger in it, the sense that we're like, red flags didn't go up. So in a way, is it because it's been neuterized by their culture, meaning it's such a strong culture internally of Chinese iconography and language that there's room for something like this to exist without it being belittling or sort of, seen in a bad light?
I think so, because it's sort of entering mass culture from a different point, right? It's building on top of a stronger foundation of knowledge that we just don't have with Asian history in the US, unless you're pursuing it at a higher level of education and choosing it as your specialty. that knowledge is not made available to us. Think about the curriculum in schools today, the foreign language courses that you're taught, the history, the scope of history is very limited. Again, 84% of the world's landmass was colonized up until the early 20th century. So there's just so much to...
More like 1950, I would say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's just so much to re-see, back to Assad's point of, the call to re-see the overlooked and the familiar. We can't cancel it all because we'll just not have any history in a way.
For sure. So to go back to the very first screen, the article you wrote and this first issue of El Decor under Assad, providing a platform for this. How do we move forward from here? How do we make sure that we build on a solid foundation in terms of the dissemination of knowledge and of cultural differences as well as similarities?
Yeah, I think it's important to stay curious, recognize that design is not just an object, it's part of a series of systems, right? Cultural values, monetary value, what we consider beautiful, the labor behind it, the way it's marketed.
Yep.
Like, why is it that an imitation ware from 18th or 17th century Europe can sell for tens, thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars at an auction house and not ever be sort of criticized as a knockoff, right? Why is that still seen as highbrow while the term made in China can conjure all sorts of questions about quality and value and how much it's worth? I think, so it's important to stay curious and just look beyond the surface level because there's so much meaning in history behind every object.
Right, so many potent stories that are kind of embedded in the things that we buy and live with and put on our bodies and put our bodies in.
Right. So I think stay curious, be curious is important, and I think you also have to be forgiving. Not to forget, but to forgive that these are transgressions that we are now acknowledging, but that we can move forward from there.
Right, and things we should and can learn from.
Right, excellent. Well, on that note, we can conclude this morning's session. I've been asked to say that between now and 2 o'clock, you're free to have lunch, maybe to actually take a leisurely stroll through the exhibition itself, and we'll meet back here at 2 o'clock. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome back, everyone, to the afternoon session for the creative convening for Monstrous Beauty, a feminist revision of chinoiserie. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce the participants in our next section. And I'll start with Patty Chang. Patty Chang is a Los Angeles-based artist and educator using performance, video, installation, and narrative forms when considering identity, gender, transnationalism, colonial legacies, the environment, large-scale infrastructural projects, and impacted subjectivities. In addition to numerous awards and fellowships, her work has been exhibited at the Museum of Modern Art, Guggenheim Museum, New Museum, M+ Museum in Hong Kong, and Moderna Museet in Stockholm, Sweden, and last but not least, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She teaches at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. Joining Patty will be Heidi Lau, and Heidi Lau's hand-built sculptures range in size from intimately scaled figures to site-responsive installations, melding an organic lightness with the structural presence of ritual vessels and primordial monuments. Drawing from mythological, historical, and environmental narratives, Lau's clay formations suggest a more permeable, anti-categorical imagining of time and space. Lau grew up in Macau and lives and works in New York. She's currently shortlisted for the M+ Museum's 2025 Sieg Prize and will be featured in the finalist exhibition in September. And moderating this panel will be Howie Chen.
Howie Chen is the director and curator of 80 Washington Square East Gallery at NYU. A founding director of Chen's, a townhouse gallery in Brooklyn, he's held curatorial roles at the Whitney Museum of American Art and MoMA PS1. He was also a director of Dispatch, a curatorial production office and project space in New York. His writings have been published by Primary Information and Badlands Unlimited and have appeared in magazines such as Art Forum, Frieze, and Art in America. In 2024, he was a co-curator of Legacies, Asian American Art Movements in New York City, 1969 to 2001 at 80 WSE, featuring over 90 artists and collectives. It was the first institutional survey exhibition focusing on artists of Asian descent who were based in New York City. Chen was a board member of Working Artists and the Greater Economy and currently serves on the board of Primary Information. Please join me in welcoming Patty, Heidi, and Howie to the stage.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Iris, for that introduction. And I just want to start off with some brief thanks. I'm grateful to be invited to moderate this panel and also be joined with two artists that I've been in conversation with in different realms of the world. And I feel like this is one of these convenings are such a great occasion to be able to get together in ways that we could never imagine. So it's kind of like the Marvel comic universe coming together in different combinations for me. For me, Monstrous Beauty is such an incisive and captivating exhibition, and it's inspiring to see such a rigorous show that speaks on so many levels. And just as a curator, I spent a bunch of time this week thinking about the show and being in it and nerding out on how the show really is working on so many registers and levels. Historical exhibition, it's a collections exhibition, it's also a contemporary art exhibition, and also an exhibition that performs a critique that's both feminist and decolonial, let's say, whatever word that people are using, among other critical registers. So rarely do you get a show that tackles that much stuff, and just on a level of exhibition making, I really nerd out on it. I want to thank Isaac Poole at the Met for organizing this panel and wrangling us, because we were just thinking about what we were going to say, and there's a lot of help on that end. Also, thank you to Patty and Heidi for joining us today. So I just wanted to start off with some chill questions. I kind of wanted to treat this as almost like an inside actor studio, because we have a formal historical exhibition, but also a contemporary component. And the contemporary component has living artists that have different perspectives and different practices that are ongoing. So I just want to take that occasion to be able to hear from the horse's mouth. Let's begin with the works that you've contributed to this exhibition that viewers can see. Particularly, while each of your pieces carries its own narrative, form, and material specificity rooted in your ongoing practices, the context amplifies how your works can inform and even critically illustrate themes that are in the show: colonialism, racialization, gender objectification, which are concepts that are part of the show's arc. But maybe I wanted to just take this opportunity to hear from you, and also to introduce to the audience which works are in the show, and just to color in how that stuff got there. Maybe we could start with Heidi.
Hi. Thank you for coming. If you have not seen the show yet, this is the piece that's installed in the shipwreck section of the exhibition, very aptly placed next to, I forgot the name of the vessel, but it's got a blue and white printed royal arm of Portuguese Empire that was printed upside down. But I want to give a little bit context of this piece. This piece is not commissioned for the exhibition. It was already in the Met collection, and I had conceived 6 of these totems plus an arch that would, in my head, form an imaginary architectural space without there being a space. And this is all, to be nerdy, hand-built in my studio. And I've been, for the last 5-6 years, I've been working with this text called San Hoi Ging, or Classics of Mountain and Seas, which is a text that has a Taoist origin from 4th century BC, really before the time, of course, pre-colonial, but also even before the time when the concept of nation existed. And a lot of the creatures, I'm going to use monsters because of the show. The construction of the monster in this book that I've been trying to tease out, for me, is a very, almost like a rejection to its own environment, or a rejection of a hierarchy, meaning like some of these creatures have 9 tails, some of these creatures represent weather or even primordial chaos. And for me, it's a way to imagine a world where living organisms are given the same resources to proliferate in this pre-colonial world. And for me, these pieces, they're like in between totems and like almost like a spine on the wall. And the space that I want them to create, it's like in between, like a house or almost like an entrapment of spirits. And I'm gonna show a few pictures from my archive. When I first was approached for this show, I immediately, this is a photo that is really low res because it's from 2006, but it's from the Macau History Museum. And it's broken shots of blue and white ceramics that the Portuguese colonizer had brought from other colonies and settled in Macau. And I don't know why I had held on these photos for so long, but when Iris reached out to me to talk about the show, and I have really had the feeling that, oh, I knew I will meet this again, but in a very different context. I think this is from the Jesuit seminary. But yeah, that's my contribution to the show.
Great. Patty, can you give us some insight on, and part of this is, I'm trying to get at is that a lot of this stuff, some of the information, it makes it to the wall labels. And part of being able to hear from the artists is before it gets framed out, before there's mediation, there are these ways of describing that comes directly from the artists themselves. So it's meant to kind of see the pre-processing of how we can describe the works that we see in the show. Yeah.
Thanks so much for being here, everyone. I want to thank everyone at the museum, Iris, Joy, Isaac, and Camille, and Heidi. Okay, so I'm going to go fast forward through all these other slides just to the piece in the show. I don't know where I'm pointing. Okay. So you're getting a preview of everything else, because I think my slides of what's in the show is actually at the very end. So, yeah, there you go. Oh, there it is. Okay. So I have actually 3 works in the show. I don't work in ceramics, much less porcelain. I do a lot of performance video work, as was mentioned in the introduction. So I have 2 early performative videos that are in the show, I think from the 1990s, late 90s. And this piece actually is a commission that was specific for the context of this show. And I have to say, came about, Howie, you don't want me to sort of get into describing all that. I'm going to just talk about the thing, right? So it was a commission, and it came about in part through conversations with Iris in relation to the theme of the exhibition. The question to me was like, if you were to put something new in this show, what would it be? We had talked about the idea of politics in relation to contemporary politics in relation to a historic show like this. And in my dream state, I decided that I wanted to make a full-size massage table out of porcelain based on our conversations in terms of the Atlanta shootings, which Ira showed a slide earlier in the introduction. And so it was this very long process of how to figure out how to make it. So you can see it's a full-size folding massage table. And it was, everything is made of porcelain. It's vitreous porcelain. I ended up working with the Kohler factory, who makes, you might know, toilets and sinks and urinals to create this piece. As you can see, it's a stark white color. And I'm gonna just go in a little bit closer. You can start to see details of the faceplate. It's recognizable as a massage table. You can see a bit of texture. I'll go a little bit closer. Oh, shoot, maybe I don't have a closer image. Wait, let me see if I do. No, okay, let me go back. So you see the faceplate, and then there's these other spots behind. If you look, I don't know, it's hard to see. Just behind me, you can see the faux stitching, and the texture is meant to look like a faux leather. And so the surface is all raw porcelain, no glazing, that's textured and is, to the touch, like a little bit rough, which porcelain shouldn't be. It's kind of pocked and porous, I guess. And then the legs, if you see in this last picture, from the front, you see the legs here, and I'm gonna just do a close-up. There's holes in the legs, just as there are those dark circles at the top. All along the legs, there's holes. And you can see it's also rough porcelain on the outside. And then it's a little bit more glossy inside the holes. And those are glazed. And then, so this is a close-up image. I just wanted to show the holes that are in the table, and how, they look very thin along the edge, right? You don't see the depth of the porcelain material itself. It gives kind of an illusory quality of there being nothing underneath. And then I'm also just pointing out the texture that I mentioned of the roughness. And then, so the outside is all raw porcelain. And then, this is Iris's photo, I believe. I'm just borrowing it. Where there's a hand next to the different holes, and then an image from the underside. If you happen to go underneath the table to see, the underside of the table is fully glazed. So underneath the table, I've used cobalt, which is in reference to the traditional blue and white Chinese porcelains, but it's applied in a different manner. It's dripped as opposed to painted, in order for it to kind of give the impression of light in water or the deep sea. And then it's not shown very clearly here, but the legs are also glazed on the inside, just like through the holes. And of course, this is made at Kohler, so all of these things are proprietary materials. It happens to be the name of the glaze that's on the legs is this color called coral, but it kind of has like a skin-like color.
So I really like hearing about, you know, the way you describe the pieces. It sets me up for the second question. You know, we looked at two pieces that are ceramic and porcelain, you know, and while I was listening to Iris's introduction and thinking about making creative connections, just listening to the description of porcelain chinoiserie, the descriptions of decor. You saw that picture of that one interior where it was almost a over surplus of chinoiserie decor, among other kind of kitsch, what we call, well, I think it's kitsch. But I was thinking about, and I had this sudden just kind of connection in my head that's still slightly unformed, but it was the recent 10-year anniversary of the publishing of the Field Sisters Racecraft, like Racecraft, which was a book that looked at the conjuring of race through practices, mundane practices that's otherwise seem mundane, that create the illusion that race itself is real. So it's, you know, and the monstrosity of race and racism, what's really insidious about it is something that seems mundane and almost plain, but it's also monstrous at the same time. So I was thinking about, oh, what is the craft? You know, just extending that, it's like, you know, thinking about wordplay, you know, the craft of ceramics, you know, and especially in this context, you know, where there's a conjuring of the other, something racialized. You know, there's something, I'm kind of pointing to a psychic and a material history and symbolism in the actual material itself, you know, so we have objects that are in the collection that are ceramic or porcelain, and then we have a few examples here that are contemporary objects that are of fired clay, mineral, and water. That's a long setup to say, like, I'm just thinking about, like, the craft, and then the material and what it conjures. And I'm curious about, maybe we'll start with Heidi, what, you know, you work in ceramics, or you work with clay, you know, and the objects are ceramic sculptures sometimes. What is your relationship to that material?
So I'm self-taught in clay. So like most of my clay knowledge, it really is just how do I say it? I think the reason why I was drawn to the material is because it actually teaches me how to use the material. Like there's like a very like cyclical relationship between me and the clay. It's not. I think it's not like I manipulate this material into something. Like I mean, if I have to be go with what I think from like reading Shanghai Jing, it's like there's like a non-hierarchical relationship between me. Like there's like only a certain amount of control I have, and then the rest kind of I really let the clay like bounce back at me, and also it's like one thing about clay is that like, it just records everything, whether it's conscious monstrous issues that we're talking about, but also just something that's unconscious, like you cannot lie. Like it's everything is like recorded from your touch. It's not just your brain knowledge. It's also like your hand and like tactile knowledge. So I think for me that's what clay that or why I make vessel. It's like a container of all these things, and sometimes not even verbal.
And you mentioned, I saw, and also in the wall text, that the piece itself, right, it's not only recording what you're making, but also it has a narrative.
Yeah.
That is also being kind of like being held in that space.
For sure. I think the narrative part for me usually comes last. Like I think I think we talked a little bit about like the suggestion first, and then like maybe like the critique after. Like I think for me, like so much of it is put in, like it's a lot. I feel like a lot of the narrative is like kind of hidden and like protected in a way, and it's kind of like maybe like lure someone to look at it longer than they would have otherwise.
And Patty, how does, like something like porcelain,
Sorry, I'm going the wrong
and
way.
I think that I know of your practice that is, material is very specific when you do choose it, and things that you employ. How do you treat a loaded material like this, especially in an exhibition that it has a lot of overdetermined factors that can contribute to the reception of the work?
Yeah, I love what you said about the clay having agency. I think that's really an important, right? Because we're talking about material. Like, we're talking about the idea that you're talking about, like the racecraft, is that there's the material itself, and then there's the meaning made from material, right? Like, sort of that relationship. And so I don't work in ceramics. This is actually my first ceramic project. I do performance. I work with, the body as material maybe, and, and other things. But my entry into porcelain and ceramics was through another project I was working on, the deep sea. And I learned from an art historian about these particular pieces behind me. I think they're both at the Victoria and Albert Museum. They are titled Sea Sculptures, and they're from the Kamau shipwreck. And the ship was bringing, lots of porcelains like nested together, like the teacups, tightly packed down to Batavia to be, shipped, exported. And on the way, maybe, near the Vietnamese coast, a kitchen fire broke out. And so, of course, ceramics are fired, to like become what they are. So the kitchen fire kind of became a second firing for the porcelains, and they got fused together. And as the ship sank to the bottom of the ocean, all the ceramics inside broke and stayed down there. And over time, sea organisms like bryozoans and corals started growing out of them. And so these are like, from auctions, and they were entered into the collection. They are called sea sculptures, which I thought that was really interesting. This art historian, Killian Quigley, talks about the idea of their name being sea sculptures and the relationship of, humans making them, but also, sea organisms making them, and he calls them like multi-species co-created objects. And so my entry point into, porcelain was this, and this was maybe right before Iris asked me to be in the show. And so I was really thinking about the idea how a lot of porcelain in the world is actually in the bottom of the ocean, and how the ocean is actually really important for the transport of porcelain from China to the rest of, the rest of the world and the different continents. And so I think that was my entry point for thinking about it. And so, I guess I was thinking it out through this idea of migration, through the idea of the ocean as being, like the material of water in relation to the material of earth as well. And then, for this particular piece, thinking about the migration of people, and that relation to the migration of people and objects, and then, their labor as well. And so the thinking about the Asian spa workers, female labor of care, therefore the massage table. And so, working from that direction, in a way kind of opposite, from like an opposite realm from how you are working with clay, right? In a very handmade way. I made mine in a factory. I'll just show a picture of that quick, if I can get to it. Anyways, factory. So it's like, this is the factory situation, right? We think of industrial manufacturing, but there's also a lot of labor involved, right? Like in order to make the piece that we made, you know, it would take like 4 grown men to open it up, lift it and turn it, and, you know, get the piece out. So, and then of course the texturing of the surface is, you know, like a lot of this working into it, and I love the idea of like the memory, you know, of the hand. Like I'm basically pounding on it, like, you know, a massage worker would be pounding on a body, right? Like there's this real like physicality involved in the relationship between our hands and body parts, you know, and that material.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that popped in my mind as you're talking is like, in a show where you're creating juxtapositions, where you have cultural crafts that are from, you know, from historical cultural crafts, and then you have contemporary art objects, right? So you're kind of putting almost 2 things, you're comparing 2 different things, the way you're describing your work, the way even the consciousness of making the work, unconsciousness, is different from, let's say, a craft worker. Whether it's a craft worker in Europe who's producing these stylized, racially stylized cultural objects, or you know, something's, you know, a craft person in Asia making it. So I guess I'm just kind of thinking about, you know, what do you, because you do work with materials that are similar, but it also points to the difference in art making, right? The stakes, the way you question, and then cultural objects. But what do you think about the differences, and also what do you think about being side by side in a show like this, like, you know, where it blurs or even kind of confounds categories?
You want me to start? Okay. I mean, I think this points also to the idea of like the institutionality, or that question about thinking about the institution, or the thematics, like working as individual artists thematically with other people, right? I mean, I think it's really interesting that our work is so different in approach in this show, especially because, you know, it's like, what's the word, the revisioning, I can't remember the title at this moment, but, you know, just rethinking this idea, right? So having these different approaches, I think is, you know, the range is really beautiful. But I'm also thinking about, you know, like how we are framed by those historical objects, right? Like that's another layer. Like we're here, we're alive, we're making things in this world. And then we have these historical objects that were made for different purposes, but are all collected in this institution, you know? So they're all being held here, and this is all a history, you know, like that's been talked about, you know, about the objects. I mean, the part of porcelain history that's really interesting to me is how like Europeans were obsessed with it and didn't know how it was made, you know, and kings would, you know, pay a ransom to like get a, you know, a magician to like basically an alchemist to make it, right? Like, so this mystery of the porcelain as a material was like an obsession, you know, the desire to possess that. And then the desire to possess the knowledge of how to make it themselves, right? Like that's the starting point. And then we have the contemporary, you know, we're using these materials, like our works are living amongst these works that were made in that context. And so I'm also thinking about like, you know, and I'm blanking out, but this happens to me in perimenopausal. Is like, you know, I'm thinking about that context as like the historical basis for like, you know, Europe, to how Europe thinks about Asia, like, you know, that sort of origin of contact through porcelain, right? Which has been talked about. But then it also is like, you know, why are we in the show? Like, what are we doing? Like, what is our work doing in the show? And, you know, how are we, you know, responding to this context? And for me, it's like, to like think about that deep history and that origin story is like so important in the present day, because it makes me go like, oh, like, this is why the dynamic is this way. Like, it's not my fault, as a person. It's like, this is the dynamic that's been set up over hundreds of years. And so, I mean, just very, like, as a response, like, just a personal response.
Yeah, I think even I just telescoped out when you said something like that, the kind of the long tail of it, but also the mise en scène feeling that there's a frame nested in a frame, and where when you put a contemporary object in there, you have to contend with the histories, but also the different registers and interpretations. And I mean, Heidi, I really think about the tight wire that you're walking with your work. In conversation, you're like, I'm not a ceramics artist, even though there's that category, and there's a market category, and there's there are collectors that collect ceramics, and you're a sculptor, or and your work, if to somebody who's less discerning, would be like, oh, there's something really oriental, or something very, whatever it is, it's ornamental or it could be in all these different categories in itself. And then plus you have this show in this institution that has its own history, that this work has to be able to navigate, be in those spaces, but also be true to what your practice as an artist is. Do you find yourself in those positions, or is that just a mode that is just specific to the way you are navigating the waters of being an artist today?
I mean, I feel like it depends. I mean, I think I want to backtrack one to respond about like us being a show working. We have such different gestures. I think for me, and I think this is related to this question too, is I'm very like self-centered and delulu sometimes. Like when I'm actually making the work, like it comes from like the love for the material. I think everything else comes so secondary in the studio, in the creation space, that like I felt like I don't even want to think about them. But in this context, I don't know. I think I always think of objects in almost like a animistic kind of way, like where like objects just inherently have so much power, and it's like feel like sometimes like for me there's almost no distinction between like personhood like myself and like the objecthood of something. Sometimes my best moment is when I made something and I don't even remember how I made it. But in this show in particular, like I think it's kind of like a cacophony. Like I feel like all the objects kind of speaks in such a different way. Like and it wouldn't have happened if all those objects are actually so different, and and some of it's so uncomfortable that it makes like I think it like accentuate each other in some ways. Right. I think that's how I think about and also like thinking about a person who is like they're like almost no like I don't know, like there is like bodies, but also like so many absence of bodies, like a massage chair with obviously reason like what with nobody on the ocean sculpture, where we was part of a shipwreck. There's so many like kind of unspoken bodies of what used to be body that has touch and used to be affected, or they used to be part of this, that it's just there quietly together. Like I think that's what for me like the most powerful about being in the show.
I love that, because I was thinking about one of the monstrosities that I just popped in my head is alienation and loss. Like when you describe like these objects that there's no bodies, or it's detached or from a subjectivity, whereas when we're talking about contemporary works where it's being animated by language, you're talking about how even the object could be a proxy for yourself. That kind of presence underlines the lack in industrialized, racialized objects in the West, or so in a way, in a way, it's kind of describing what the contemporary is in relation to these objects that are from the past. So I guess I didn't know we could be able to land on the final question. It's like one of those.
What was the final question? Oh.
I know, I have to pull it out like the actor studio. I guess, this is something that's more about you working as artists in America. We were talking about that we're interpolated, we're called on to do, even as a curator, I get called on to do things that are themed, or, I get called on to be, whether you are interpolated as being a woman artist, or as a minority artist, or an Asian American artist, or Asian artist. I wonder, there's multiple calls in this exhibition, right? Because the show has these different critical valences, whether it's feminist or decolonial, or about East or West, or those things. Yeah, I wonder, and this is just a larger question, is how do you navigate, having your own practice that's singular and you're on your own exploration, how do you navigate these calls? Like when you get a call from a curator, this is the theme, or hey, we're doing a ceramic show, or hey, this is a performance show. How are you able to be in the world when there's so many calls for you in that way?
You want to start then? Kind of an identity show, but it didn't start that way. Like it started as something else. It started as more like a relational community, mentor type of relation between different artists, but then gets framed in different ways publicly, right? When you need the exhibition text and you need the press release or whatever. So I think it's one of those things where there's multiple levels of thinking about what a show, for instance, about any type of identity is, because there's so many different ways to frame it. And those are things that are outside of my control. So there's that. And then there's specific calls, Iris writing to me, asking me to be in this particular show, where there are existing works in the show, and then I have commission the new work for the show, which is about a relational conversation about the material that then informs how I proceed, to work in relation to this particular exhibition. So I think there's really a particularity about being in these different contexts, or and yes, there's and I find this context actually quite interesting, this particular show, and so I was happy to be involved in it. But I do think I'm following my own trajectory, and then sometimes things overlap. Like for instance, the piece I showed of the coral growing on porcelain. That is oh, actually that's something that I've been thinking about. The bottom of the ocean and the ocean in terms of migration. And so it really was specific. I think it's working through specifics and non-abstractions like race and gender, right? But
I think I think for me, there's the question with the representation, or I think in my earlier days, so I grew up in Macau, and there is actually so few representation of any cultural production from my home city that I did at the time felt like I should say yes, just because every time someone find out that I have relation to the city, they're like, oh, I've never met anyone from, that's usually the first question, the response I get. But in terms of on the maybe personal and the work, I think every time I imagine or like actually work with an institution like at Greenwood Cemetery like 2 years ago. Like I almost like see myself as some kind of like instigator to like a spy to kind of like sneak something into this existing very well thought out narrative or identity of this organization that didn't exist before. So it's kind of like adding like a syncopation to the that's how I think about it. And if I can think of way that for that relationship to be interesting, or at least in some ways sabotage a little bit, then I mean sometimes I would say no to the certain kind of framing.
Also, just a follow-up to that is that, you know, when we were talking about the questions in our Zoom preparations, you mentioned Joan Key's geometries, and I was thinking about something from the introduction in that book about thinking about questioning situations, the idea of questioning situations. And it's kind of also like, you know, there's not necessarily binaries being set up, but when you can like put something really, you know, like, not definable in, you know, that it opens up the situation in these like geometries and possibly bringing in questioning situations, right? Where it is more generative to actually be included, even if, you know, like it's framed in this way that you actually can be an agent in opening things up.
Yeah, I'm kind of taken by what you just said, and also this idea of smuggling. I think, like, you know, one of the I can tell, you know, I think the type of spaces that could be opened up is often when you're invited into institutions, you know, it's about, you know, there are constraints, but also sometimes when a curator, when there's care, right, when they're caring for objects or caring for relationships and caring for discourse, you know, they will leave the car with the keys for you, you know, to go, hey, this is what we have here, but the keys are in the ignition, you know, and that's the freedom of it. So whether chinoiserie as like a style or as a, you know, or a material history, those are things that I think that gave a little bit more space to work with than normally being in these categories. So, I mean, I'm just kind of thinking out loud too, but I guess we're out of time. All right, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Patty, Heidi, and Howie. I think that was an excellent setup as an actor's studio. Maybe we should have an artist studio. And I think it's always amazing to get actual artist voice shared, and that's the beauty of working with contemporary artists. We're going to move on to the next conversation, focusing on the beauty standards and aesthetics, and I'm happy to introduce Alka Manon and Elise Hu. Alka Manon is an assistant professor of sociology at Yale University, where she's also affiliated with Department of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies and the Council on Southeast Asian Studies. She's the author of an award-winning book entitled Refashioning Race: How Global Cosmetic Surgery Crafts New Beauty Standards. She received her PhD in sociology from Northwestern University. And Elise Hu is a journalist based in LA who spent more than a decade at NPR as a correspondent and host, and worked as a television correspondent for Vice News Tonight. Today, she's the host of TED Talks Daily, a flagship podcast from TED, and a co-host of Forever 35, a women's focused show about the ways in which we take care of ourselves. As an international correspondent, she reported from more than a dozen countries and opened NPR's first ever Seoul bureau. Her experience in Asia inspired her nonfiction book titled Flawless: Lessons in Looks and Culture from the K-Beauty Capital. Please welcome Elise and Alka.
Thank you all so much. It is such an honor to be here among you and at the Met. We are going to not talk about objects specifically, but the ways that our bodies become objectified and the ways that the standards or norms of chinoiserie have shown up and have been mapped onto the human body. And so to get things going, Alka is going to kind of do a little scene setter and talk a little bit about her work and her research into this area, and I will too, and then we'll just be in a quick chat.
Thank you, Elise. And I want to thank the organizers for inviting us. In particular, shout outs to Isaac and Camille for helping the day run so smoothly. So I'm going to start by giving a little bit of a backdrop of my book, Refashioning Race, which looks at how cosmetic surgeons act as gatekeepers to ideal or appropriate appearances. Actually, yeah, I have the cover here. But really, the central plot point of my book is thinking about what happens when one single beauty ideal about how bodies should look like begins to expand. And we think about other kinds of ideals alongside of it. What does that proliferation of ideals mean? And so I look at cosmetic surgery and cosmetic surgeons in particular in the US and Malaysia to get some purchase on that question. You know, when these beauty ideals expand, when surgeons in particular try to develop an Asian ideal of beauty in contrast to explicitly a Western ideal of beauty, what does that mean and what consequences does that have? And cosmetic surgeons are particularly interesting as a set of actors who are both interpreters of what abstract beauty ideals are, but they have to make it concrete and put it on the bodies in front of them, which sometimes resist them in some form. And so, again, a little bit different than the objects that maybe we've been talking about through the day here, but there's something interesting, and there's going to be a lot of through lines, I think, in what we're talking about there. So I want to give you a little bit of imagery to work with here. So these are some photographs that I took in my research in Kuala Lumpur of what images of Asian beauty were portrayed as being. And these are just street scenes of some advertisements where beauty clinics were selling cosmetic surgery procedures or beauty products. And a frequent theme was, in Malaysia in particular, was what a set of pan-Asian beauty ideals that were really rooted in Korean beauty products and techniques, which Elise will talk a little bit more about in her book here. But there's different flavors here of what Asian means, and one interesting finding that came out of my research is it's not just a sort of physical expectation on the body, but it's also the cultural meanings around it. And surgeons were very aware of how the same exact appearance might read quite differently to audiences locally in Malaysia versus even across the border into Singapore, let alone in the United States. And so if someone like me came in and said, hey, I want to get plastic surgery, I'm going to be a TV presenter, what do you suggest for me? One surgeon told me, well, your accent says you're American. Is that where you're trying for this? Versus, are you going to do this in Malaysia? Are you going to do this in India? We might recommend different things. So there's a cognizance of the idea of beauty as a social construct, as something that might vary across time and space. And they have to make those distinctions. And so that's one way of fixing these, again, abstract ideals in place. And they recognize that this changes and that it's a social practice that is rooted in particular cultural contexts. So that's the sort of flavor of what this looks like on the ground. One last thing here is how this kind of ties into a longer history. So this is, if you've been with us all day, this is a image you've seen often from the exhibition of a woman from Manchu. And this kind of image actually made an appearance in plastic surgery conferences by way of illustration of what, of a genealogy of Asian beauty that is hundreds of years old rather than decades old, right? And so this is a complicated image. This exact one did not come up on the conference stages, but ones like it, where surgeons were trying to highlight a long-standing preference for fairer skin, smooth skin, rounder faces, bigger eyes, and would pull on images from art to do so. And so it was often done, it depended on the nation where a surgeon was from, but in the context of trying to create a story for Asian beauty ideals, art is actually quite an important way that this came up. So
I actually want to jump in on this because this reminds me, and we didn't talk about this before we came out on stage, was that double eyelid surgery, which is one of the most popular surgeries in Asia, and that's if you were born with kind of, I guess it's called a monolid, you get upper eye blepharoplasty to get a, quote, double eyelid. And a US Marine surgeon claims to have invented it in order, and he worked on, I guess, sex workers at the Yongsan base in Seoul, South Korea during the Korean War, who were hired by American servicemen. And so there is that history of sort of violence and occupation that then extends into plastic surgery and some of the ideals. And he claims to have invented it in order to have Asian women look less Asian.
Yeah, so that's a super interesting example. So when I looked into this, I found some blepharoplasty procedures in Japan, written in Japanese.
That's what I was going to say. It wasn't actually this David Millard, it turns out.
No, exactly. Yeah. And so what does it mean for the genealogy of the Asian eyelid surgery to be tied to David Millard versus Japanese surgeons, and why were Japanese practitioners not part of this lineage? Well, there's language factors, but also Japan colonized many of the regions, and people did not want to seek Japanese mentors in that period where the Americans were occupying Korea. So there's other kinds of imperial colonial dynamics that make it such that Western, at a particular moment, was seen as a pathway that people preferred to genealogically trace to, even if there might be other ways that this popped up around Asia too.
Right, so history really informs the culture here. Shall I move on? Okay,
please.
Fantastic. So my big thesis in Flawless is that the future has kind of already arrived, the future of aesthetic improvement and certain pan-Asian beauty standards or global beauty standards had already arrived in Seoul 10 years ago when I first moved there and this book begins, and it just wasn't evenly distributed. That the aesthetic norms and the bodily modification that we would see eventually everywhere was already happening in Korea, and that's in large part borne out because Korea tends to be about 10 to 15 years ahead when it comes to certain procedures and products that you can get to improve yourself. Now we're seeing this term Instagram face or meta face, and as Elka talks about, Pan-Asian beauty standards, they're kind of a mix-up and of both Western and Eastern traditional standards that are showing up on the body. But of course, you don't get to achieve an Instagram face or a Pan-Asian beauty standard without a lot of intervention, which Korea is really expert at. Something like nearly half of all Korean women that are college-aged say that they have already undergone some sort of cosmetic surgery. It's all about optimizing your face and your body. Korea is the cosmetic surgery capital of the world, about 4 times more cosmetic surgeons per capita than the United States, and more per capita than anywhere else in the world. Right now, there's a lot of non-invasive procedures that are very hot. This is trap tox and Botox, body Botox in your calves. That's Botoxing the muscles at the base of your neck in order to make your neck appear like slimmer and more elongated, ditto with the calves, and a lot of K-pop idols are rumored to have done this. And this really speaks to the global beauty standards, and academics have found there are 4 global beauty standards of thinness, firmness, smoothness, and youth. And what I found in my research for Flawless is that that technology is a huge part of this story, that this is techno-optimization, and that the aesthetic ideals that we talk about, these 4 global norms, have been really mapped on to the body. Let me just go back here. And today's standards are essentially written by what I call a technological gaze, which is kind of a more insidious male gaze because it's doing it for the algorithm. It's that we are imitating a kind of art today, but that art is what we're seeing on screens. It's what we're consuming and seeing and hearing, and largely trying to fit into a certain kind of sameness. And that sameness is made possible by a lot of aesthetic enhancements and improvements that Asia has become expert in. And the project of these unrealistic beauty standards end up kind of devaluing and disembodying us from our humanity. And the other big idea is that beauty has often, both historically and now, operated as a function of class, really. And so this is actually how I want to link back to chinoiserie and I'd love, Alka, for you to talk about how today's beauty standards and what we're seeing in terms of trends on the body are a presentation of class in the way that a lot of these objects and seeking the objects of chinoiserie were hundreds of years ago.
Yeah, that's a great starting point for jumping off. So when we think about, when I talk about the proliferation of beauty ideals, there's a few ways that they have changed. And one is moving from this idea of one Western kind of white ideal of beauty to different kinds of ethnic ideas. But another is a class differentiation, right? As cosmetic surgery came down in price, as cosmetics, period, became more affordable, this is something that everybody can buy, maybe with a layaway plan or the aid of some sort of loan program as well. But then what's distinguishing is not that you've done surgery, but what looks that you're getting, right? And so that becomes the way that you can signal something about your class consumption. I mean, in an earlier area where it was very expensive to get plastic surgery from board-certified plastic surgeons, then maybe it was a sign of conspicuous consumption to get it, and then to go around with your bandages afterwards saying, look, I invested myself. And this is still the case in some places where that is the signal that this is a big investment that you've done in yourself. But now it's the end look, right? That what you're trying to signal, there's a debate in the United States about the size of breasts. Like if it's really big, that signals something different than something that's merely bigger or a lift after, to restore to a previous, more youthful version of yourself. So I think class and consumption and what you can signal about your identity using cosmetic surgery is very much part of the game here too.
It also struck me, especially in conversation with some of the panels this morning, was that so much of the critique of chinoiserie is about exoticization and these days, and objectification. And these days, so much of the women I talk about how they want, this is their choice. They want to change their identities and fit these norms. And so there's kind of a self-objectification happening. Can you tell us what you've learned about that on that front?
I think that the consumption through line is an important angle, both with thinking about chinoiserie up to the present. What can you signal, like in our capitalist society today, you are perceived as signaling something with your purchasing choices, but also your body and the differentiation of your body is a pretty critical part of the way that you go about and inhabit the world. People do evaluate you based on how you look and what you wear and what you are seen with. And so people feel like, okay, that context is not one that most of us can opt out of, but what you can have some choice over is what you do, right? What choices you make. And so that's what's emphasized as opposed to the sort of larger structure in which people, that economic or political or social values are being imparted based on the appearance.
So then is exoticism still extended to today's beauty standards or Asian beauty standards?
I mean, I think that this is a really interesting question, right? Like, I think in certain kinds of contexts, exoticism absolutely would be a value added, an advantage over other kinds of things. I'm thinking about modeling, that there's a lane for looking different, right? Sure. But there's also a lane for looking the same, or for not looking too different, right? So who are the gatekeepers and what is the context in which this is happening here? And I think also what's different in thinking about chinoiserie versus now, what direction is this going, right? I think chinoiserie was very much about a Western imagination of the East, of the Orient, right? Whereas with the kinds of ideals we're seeing out of Korea, the way that they're taken up in Malaysia and in the United States as well as other places, there's a sense that Korea is the future and that other people might be wanting to inhabit that future. And that's an exoticization, but it's an aspirational one that is not rooted, I think, in the exact same process as before. So it's this kind of, there is a racialized cyborg element here, but I think that it's an interesting dynamic to think through as a different set of directional flows.
Yeah, so should we be more okay with it if the direction flows the other direction? And I ask that because I'm thinking of Ollie London in particular. Who knows who Ollie London is as an example? So he is the guy who so revered BTS and Jimin in particular, but he's a white guy. or they're they. I'm sorry, I don't mean to misgender Ollie. They have, I think, underwent dozens of surgeries in order to look like Jimin, and faced a lot of criticism as a result. So what should we make of, or what are ways to think about kind of the reverse flow when those with more Eurocentric features seek to appear more Asian?
I think this is a moment where a lot of the things that we've been saying about hierarchies, superiorities, history, how it's invoked, get tested, right? Like, to what extent is this about linked to a sort of political power move of what's going on? To what extent is this linked to capitalist desire for novelty, right? That this is a trend and that the other trend has already happened, and if you really want to make a distinction or stand out, this is something that you would have to do now. So I think it's kind of an open question, but one thing that is really clear with the beauty trends back and forth, and if you look back in history, is that they change, right? That there is this back and forth, and we often pay attention to the flows in one moment in time, but if you kind of look at it in this longer perspective about who's exoticized by whom, you get a slightly different picture.
Is it a more affirmative, is Pan-Asian beauty and this like mixing and melding of global standards now a more affirmative objective or standard?
I'm going to answer and then turn that question back on you. So I think one of the things that I end the book on is I think that it is that representation does have an effect, and that this expansion or proliferation of beauty ideals is better than having one, certainly, like a hegemonic ideal large across the world, but it doesn't change the game, the stakes of a game in which people feel like they are judged based on how their body looks, what physical appearance is, and beauty is dependent on a hierarchy right now, right? That there's something aspirational to work towards. So I think from that standpoint, there's some work to be done about the larger structures that do put so much value on the body. But what do you think?
Yeah, so I often get asked about more and more men getting plastic surgery and male beauty standards, because South Korean men consume something like 30% of all skincare for men products in the world. And so you see a sort of gender equality in the consumption of beauty culture and beauty industry products and procedures. But I often say, like, okay, I guess that is getting towards a kind of equality, but not necessarily the equality we want because of the nature of the demands. The nature of the demands are that we are supposed to be laboring with our bodies to change them and believe that they aren't worthy unless we buy into a certain system as dictated by beauty industry standards and culture. So it's not better, but I guess it is a kind of equity.
Right. I think it's always a challenge to think about the extent to which identities and bodies, like we could think historically identities and bodies were linked. You were what you were. You didn't have a whole lot of money to change clothes, to have makeup. For most of history, you're trying to work on subsistence and survival, right? So now that there is this premium put on identifying the self with the appearance, then the stakes go up for what you can do there. But that comes with its own costs, and there's other things that we can be doing. And I'm thinking about this conversation we were having backstage about beauty work is time-consuming. It's invisible labor that people are performing. So I'm kind of curious how you think about that. Like, if men are taking on these costs too, is that evening the playing field?
Same answer. Yeah, in some ways it does even the playing field, but should we all be spending our time and energy and resources in this way when we could be showing up in the world in other, like, more politically relevant ways? And I just want to go back to one of the points you were making about sort of this global standard maybe being wider.
Yeah.
Like, maybe more parts of our bodies are acceptable that weren't before. So I'm thinking like bigger butts that were big in the global south, or a lot of the standards that people were kind of looked down upon, bigger lips, and now people in the West are seeking. But I don't know that standards have widened in creating in the creation of a global standard, because there is a sort of sameness that the internet and algorithms tend toward. And that sameness is driven by these social platforms that optimize for engagement and social platforms that show us what we're supposed to look like. right? They give us filters, and in our digital filters, they smooth our skin naturally. And often will soften our jawlines or make our jawlines more narrow. And these are just in the filters that we're shown, presenting us ideals. And it occurs to us, of course, that the way that K-beauty talks about skin is often as porcelain skin or glass skin. Some of these materials that are so inherent to chinoiserie and objects in and of themselves. And so I don't know that sameness is a widening, I guess, of standards.
I mean, I definitely think that there's this ongoing tension between standardization and customization that we see with beauty standards, because, you know, if everybody is eventually going to look the same, you get a mark of distinction when you look different, right? That's when the exotic is held out as having potentially unique economic benefits. Or social benefits, that you get more attention and people know who you are. And so that's something that I found in my research surgeons actually sought to balance, that they would use something, an intermediate category like racial categories. And so they come to reshape racial categories in that process, because they're like, well, this is not exact same like everybody else, but it's not just totally customizing every single person in front of you such that you're never sure walking in the door as a prospective patient what you're going to get. You want to have some idea, right? So I think that tension is one that different people have solved in different ways, and I think the addition of algorithms as kind of statistically moving people to a standardized norm is absolutely going to make a difference.
What do you feel like is feeding the modern plastic surgery standards today? I remember a lot of the coverage in the 90s about what people wanted to look like was that they would bring in photos of celebrities and want to change themselves to look like celebrities, but a lot of Korean surgeons in recent years, as I've interviewed them, say, you know, people don't bring in photos of celebrities, they bring in photos of themselves when looking their best. But what did you find in places like Southeast Asia?
Yeah, so I found a mix that wish pics that people would aspirationally bring in were in some cases celebrities, they were photographs of themselves, sometimes they were photographs with filters of how they would like to look, but technologically mediated. Sometimes they were photographs of family members, of saying this particular feature that my mom has, I would like it to look just like that. So I think that and that was true both in Malaysia and in the United States for patients who were seeking things at that time. But I should note that my conversations with patients and surgeons happened about 10 years ago. So really, as the filter wave was kind of ramping up, and I suspect that more would be technologically mediated now.
I remember in the first session today, we talked about one of the first objects in the exhibit, or first paintings in the exhibit, that reverse mirror, and how it was both seductive and unsettling. And I remember reacting to that observation thinking, that's how I felt about plastic surgery. You know, and that's how I felt about sort of post-op bodies when I first got to Seoul 10 years ago. There were a lot of folks, and often tourists. It was cosmetic surgery or medical tourists, and medical tourism is a big industry in Korea. There were a lot of folks in like post-op bandages, or even like full-on Jason masks, you know, or hockey masks. And I remember sort of feeling judgmental about it. Like, why would these people, you know, spend so much money on fixing their face, or why would you want to change your face this much? And by the time I left 4 years later, I had a real transformation in that it seemed completely logical, because there is such a pretty privilege, and that lookism, this idea of being judged based on your looks and being sort of discriminated against based on your looks, was such a powerful force that it made complete sense to try and modify your bodies, right? Or try to augment how you looked, because it afforded you social, political, economic capital. If that is the case, if we are all living in a world in which, at least in the developed world, there is a kind of pretty privilege, and you can benefit from looking more conventionally beautiful, where does that leave us?
I mean, it leaves us with a lot of work to do, right? I think that that there are, we can think about the social, economic, political arrangements that make pretty privilege have these benefits, right? This is not necessarily an accident. It can be an accident who gets pretty privilege. I think, you know, that's one of the potentially appealing things about it, that it's a genetic lottery. That's what it feels like, right? But it's not a genetic lottery how we treat it, right? There are absolutely other ways of organizing our communities, other ways of valuing people, other ways of thinking about the self and other. You know, as you were telling this or saying this just now, I was thinking about this question of, well, what does beautification do, right? There's the external, like for other people, the audiences, and how people react to you. And then there was this older set of questions early on with the history of plastic surgery about matching the external surface of the body to the internal dynamics in the self. And often when plastic surgeons would talk about what patients were looking for, some of them would rely on these old face reading traditions from Korea, from China, which essentially used the face or the body as a map to the soul, right? So then if you change the exterior surface, you're trying to change something to other people about your soul, right? Signaling something about your soul. But are you changing the soul, right? There's the question of what is the self that that can be represented, that people feel like isn't represented, such that they do seek cosmetic surgery, versus this kind of the signaling function that I think it does have for people. Like, how are people going to perceive me if I change the outside to get the treatment that I deserve, right? Everyone should be treated well, regardless of how their physical appearance looks.
A funny little aside to this is that I interviewed some face readers. So getting your face read is very normalized in Korea. And I asked some of these face readers, like, what if somebody drastically changed their face? Does it change their fortune? And I remember one saying, of course it changes their fortune, you know? And so they're totally also bought in on this like capitalistic dream, right?
I mean, it's really convenient, right? That if just spending money to change something means that the problem is fixed or that you're treated the way that you think you're deserved, but the standards keep ramping up for everybody if everybody does this, right? Nobody gets to that level of universal equality through spending. So it's like, it's the hope, it's the aspiration that capitalism, I think, is really driving.
Yeah, I do worry that we get into this bodily augmentation arms race. And it's only getting more and more cyborgian. You know, we look more and more inhuman and get farther away from our souls. So I know we're trying to keep to time and be respectful to you all. So Alka, just to wrap things up, ultimately, what might be a more affirmative alternative vision for external beauty standards and the role that they play in our societies?
Yeah.
I know it's a big question, so you can take it however you want.
I mean, I think one thing that, one way I'll answer this is, I don't think it should be ignored. I think there's some continuities with the way that that chinoiserie has been talked about, that this is a consumer thing, it's a women's thing, it's not high culture, it's decorative arts. And similarly, I think beauty for the body has been dismissed this way, that
Absolutely.
This is just
it's
a frivolous...
like women's magazine stuff. Right?
Exactly, and that it's frivolous and we don't have to take it seriously and this is just people being shallow. But I think as we're both pointing to, it's like people are motivated to do this for reasons that do have pretty profound impacts on their overall life trajectories, and so we should take this seriously. And we should think about, we should not just dismiss this as something that is not real. I think that taking it seriously is the first step.
And then, you know, and I often say it's such a privilege to be in conversation about these topics because I think awareness is really key, and just even examining and critiquing and analyzing how we got here and how it's tied into not only our history but also kind of the direction of humanity's future. So thank you again to the Met. Thank you to all of you. We could talk about these things for a long time, so maybe you can find us after off stage. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Alka and Elise, for a really informative discussion. I know I have to do my homework by watching The Substance. That's the first on my watch list. But thank you so much for a really exciting conversation. I'm absolutely thrilled to close out our wonderful day by introducing Anne Anlin Chang, who will be giving our keynote lecture this afternoon. Anne Anlin Chang is Louis W. Fairchild Class of 24 Professor of English at Princeton University. She is an interdisciplinary scholar and author of 4 books: The Melancholy of Race, Second Skin, Ornamentalism, and most recently, a book of personal essays, Ordinary Disasters. She was a scholar in residence at MoMA, and her nonfiction essays can be found in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Los Angeles Review of Books, Hyperallergic, among others. Please join me in welcoming Anne Anlin Cheng.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. I want to thank the Met for this wonderful opportunity to work with this incredibly thoughtful and creative exhibition, and then to be here today in the company of these wonderful artists, scholars, and practitioners. So let's begin by entering into this ceramic forest built by Lee Soo-kyun. Are we looking at growth or arrested development? Echoes of organic remains or synthetic parts? Recuperated shards or stranded fragments? Explosion or implosion? Domesticity or its failure? Is this a scene of devastation or survival? To answer these questions, we have to first reconstruct a vast and endearing trans-global history involving porcelain, race, femininity, and the role of aesthetic in an embattled philosophic debate about value. The ornament and the decorative arts in general, while signaling material wealth, has largely been seen as a minor, even degraded aesthetic category, and we talked about that a lot today. They have signaled female vanity, superfluousness, and false distraction that lead us away from true moral value and genuine beauty. Immanuel Kant claimed that ornamentation is a form of inessential argument. E.H. Gombrich warned against the ornament's dazzling effect to persuade the mind to submit without reflection. Krakauer and Benjamin worried over the disenchantment produced by the mass ornament. Walt Whitman argued that most works are most beautiful without ornament. And who could forget modernism's most terse denouncement, Adolf Loos's dictum that ornament is crime? The ornament in Western philosophy has thus almost always been associated not only with the effeminate, but also, less notably, with the so-called Oriental. Plato called sophistry's rhetorical ornamentation to be Oriental. Marco Polo wrote about how you can hardly distinguish Chinese women from their seductive ornaments. And one can find musing about the monstrous ornamentality of the Chinese from 18th century aesthetic debates about Protestant purity to the writings of Friedrich Schiller and Gottfried Semper, and in literature from Joris Karl Huysmans to Oscar Wilde to Ezra Pound. Given this very extensive history, it is hardly surprising that men as diverse as William Morris, Adolphe Loos, and Le Corbusier will come to stake the integrity of the modern masculinist and nationalist Euro-American character on the very rejection of the ornamental and the Oriental. This category of small, insignificant objects has thus, in fact, been a trigger for heated debates for centuries about the distinction between essence and superficiality, the peripheral and the central, femininity and masculinity, atavism and futurity. The merging of the Oriental with the ornamental, what I call ornamentalism, can be found through the century in visual expressions as well, from Art Nouveau to French symbolism to Rococo, and all the way up to wide-ranging iteration in the 20th and 21st centuries. Let us take for a moment to allow this massive history to sink in. This extensive racial, aesthetic, and ornamental project is both world-making and world-erasing, at once producing a great deal of beauty and highly extractive. One of the great ironies of the trope of the ornamental yellow woman is the fact that the ornaments soon took over. We don't even need a real Asian woman to be around to borrow and invoke her most palpable, fully sensorial, supple, and radiant presence. Her sensuality and decadence can be easily invoked by a host of colonial objects, from silk to costume to fans to especially porcelain. Ever since the Portuguese first brought Chinese ceramic back to Europe in the 16th century, and for the next 300 years or so, this reputed white gold has preoccupied European material commerce, social culture, and racial imagination. Historians have documented the impact of Chinese porcelain for the West, its importance in early global imperial trades, its role in spurring European technological invention and decorative design, its impact on growing economic and cultural values in Denmark, Germany, France, as well as England and its American colonies. Our own George Washington staked his social status on his extensive and meticulous collection of Chinaware. What is so uncanny in the history of the porcelain for the West is how its multivalent physical properties started to get transcribed onto the imagined bodies from whom the material came. Known not only for its glossy beauty, precarious refinement, and receptivity to color and design manipulation, Chinese porcelain was also highly prized for its surprising durability, its miraculous capacity to sustain the extreme high heat that lent to its translucency. Translucent porcelain, this came to connote both hardness and flexibility, old world beauty and new world technology, fragile daintiness and insensate coolness, a mixture of antithetical symbolic meanings that are then ascribed to, indeed become, the very stuff of Asiatic femininity. So today, as we just saw from the last panel, the fantasy and the cliche of porcelain glassy Asian skin, fetishized by multi-billion-dollar pharma cosmetic industry, recalls and cashes in on this long history of the imagined merging of Chinese female flesh as porcelain and porcelain as Chinese female flesh. And today, this confusion of Asiatic femininity with artificial life survives and thrives in popular culture. The synthetic Asiatic woman is an, if not the original cyborg. In this last image in particular, which is your right, we see how a lovely cherry blossom decorative pin pierces seamlessly and bloodlessly through the Asiatic woman's flesh. See how her once startling artificial blue eye marks her as a creature of futurity and blindness. Haunting the margins of this very pretty picture is a cruel 19th century discourse about Chinese coolies who were said to be insensate to heat and inure to pain, making them the ideal disposable laborers. The ubiquitous Chinese female cyborg in science fiction today, from Blade Runner to Ex Machina to Cloud Atlas, represents the convergence of two strands of racialized gender, the pretty decorative Asian woman on the one hand, and the labor-bearing Asian male coolie on the other, right? So they merge in the figure of the cyborg. At once the lotus blossom and the dragon lady, the butterfly and the prostitute, the aestheticization of the yellow woman is attended by denigration itself. Hollywood likes to give us a dream. But here's the political reality. Monstrous beauty indeed. The beauty of the exotic yellow woman has always been an ugly business. In the 19th century, her concupiscence was not only the stuff of caricature, but also written into law in US immigration policy. In the 20th and 21st century, this queasy combination of beauty and denigration continues to haunt the figure of the Asian woman. We can think of the recent brutal targeted killing of 6 women of Asian descent in Atlanta, killed because the shooter reviled his own desire for exotic Asian women, as our present-day real-life iteration of this fantasy, a heartbreaking reenactment of the violence that can emerge from this confusion of desire and contempt. In the face of this brutality, the question is no longer, how can we think about aesthetics in the face of violence, but rather, how could we not? Patty Chang's 1998 video, melons at a loss, reminds us with heartbreaking bluntness the physical and psychical legacy of this history, and asks the question, how does violence on the outside get lived as violence on the inside? Now, we can chalk up this vast history that I've been talking about, including chinoiserie, up to what Edward Said calls Orientalism, a project of colonial control, a bureaucratization of invidious desire, and inauthentic appropriation. And that critique is totally on the mark. But part of the problem about calling something a stereotype that we tend to stop looking at it. What I had wanted my sort of made-up turn of ornamentalism to do was not just to name a symptom of the collapse between the ornament and the oriental, but also to force us to think deeper about the relationship between the states of being an object and the states of being a subject. When we dismiss this history as simply more of the same, we miss the opportunity to see and see afresh. We would miss, for example, the chance to discern the forms of strange life that this history has bred. We would miss alternative modes or assemblages of non-human life that nonetheless carry profound human memory. Saidian Orientalism highlights the invidious uses of Oriental things for Western thinkers and artists. But objects have wayward lives, and sometimes they speak too, if we're willing to listen. In recent years, museums have been increasingly being accused of being repositories of colonial rapaciousness, but museums are also critical guardians of historical memory and how that past continues to shape our present, which is especially important given how willfully forgetful our current moment is. This is where the exhibit Monstrous Beauty makes one of its most profound intellectual and imaginative interventions. The uncanny objects in the show tell us alternative stories that have been either marginalized or silenced. The show, for example, excavates the surprising uses of porcelain for white European women, like Queen Mary, who deployed her porcelain progeny as reclamation for her lost fertility and authority. It also brings to the foreground the deep sediments of multiple histories that have produced these strange, alternative hybrid forms of life. Even more importantly, I think the show invites us to consider how chinoiserie can in fact not only broaden but reshape the terms of contemporary feminism itself. For thinking about the very peculiar figure of the yellow woman as a human, non-human ornament applies tremendous pressure on politically treasured notions of agency and fleshly incorporation. That is, if feminism has for a long time cherished and touted the real woman as a kind of antidote to objectification, then the history of chinoiserie compels us to ask a different kind of question, which is, what can action or agency look like for someone who emerges out of this history of thingliness? What does it mean to survive as an object? Let us consider this from an earlier exhibition at the Met. Some of you will recognize it. This piece is from the 2017 show, China Through the Looking Glass. And it stood in its obdurate presence among a company of silky and fluffy dresses as if it was their easy peer. But it wasn't so comfortable among those other dresses, because is it a dress, or is it a woman, or is it a statue? It is in fact designed to be wearable, but the human wearer would immediately find herself immobilized, were she couldn't even sit down, right, in this outfit. Made by the contemporary Chinese artist Li Xiaofan, this piece is clearly not human, but nor is it entirely a thing. It is both statue and fossilized body, dress and armor, beautiful and crude, winged victory, and the mad woman in the attic. Here, the useful Chinese female body has been petrified into a collage of domestic and collectible vessels, broken pieces of teapot, plates. Entitled Beijing Memory Number 5, Li's 2009 sculpture was part of a series known for using ceramics that he would excavate from archaeological sites throughout China. The catalog attributes the ceramic fragment to the Qing dynasty, commonly known as the last great Chinese dynastic empire, suggesting that the memory being recuperated here may be the memory of a lost imperial China. Yet, Beijing Memory Number 5 exercises a very particular and peculiar complex meditation on the idea of Chinese statedness itself, because its insistence on historicity upon closer look turns out to have suffered a lot of manipulation. In the constructed rubble that is the body of the ceramic woman, we discern a scattering of some still intact Chinese ideograms. Many of the characters are out of context, and several are positioned upside down, maybe an ironic statement about value or a jab at the old joke about Chinese being illegible for Western viewers. But we can make out certain words like precious, tea, superior. Some seem to offer a very precise self-authentication with stamped reign dates, such as the Zhuang dynasty's reign of the great Ming dynasty, which is actually much earlier, right, than the Qing dynasty. The sharks date themselves even further back in time to the Ming dynasty, suggesting that we cannot actually be complacent about these fragments' promises of time, because these certification of provenance, both inside and outside the artwork, only serve to underscore the homelessness of these fragments. Given that the practice of inscribing dates onto objects to authenticate origin dates had degraded fairly early on into affectation and even forgery sometimes, this kind of designation is highly to be likely to be much more misleading than not. So memory and nostalgia are being here both highlighted and undermined at the same time. Beijing Memory Number 5 enjoys a bittersweet beauty because it is petrified, and yet it still recalls organic life. The sculpture invokes a vanished China only to unsettle the very authenticity of the thing that is gone. Just as it has summoned the memory of yellow female flesh only to replace it with a more insistent inorganic presence. This feels much less like a nostalgia for yellow female flesh than a consecration of its fossilized afterlife. If the yellow woman has always been simultaneously embodied and erased through ornamental objectness, then this piece asks what is or could be life after such devastation. This ceramic woman is a mechanical assemblage forged out of abandoned, erratic residue, making her something of a teleological sister, philosophically speaking, to the other contemporary mechanical assemblages. Is it a coincidence that Asian women artists today in the diaspora are meditating on what Iris Moon calls the porcelain imaginary and what I call ornamentalism, that at times coercive, but also at times transformative, transitive property between persons and things? I think not. The question of personhood, corporeal embodiment, and their erasures has been a central crisis and the condition for making Asiatic womanhood in Western cultures for a very long time. Walking through the deep galleries of the European sculpture and decorative arts in order to reach the stairs that go down into the lower Robert Lehman wing, where the exhibition is housed, one feels like Persephone descending into Hades' underworld. If Hades' realm were in fact a female-dominated, glittering landscape of non-living things teeming with life. One is greeted at first by an arresting congregation of ceramic assemblages by Yi Suk-yang. There's magic here, and there's grief. There's stillness, but there's also vibrancy and proliferation, a strange life indeed. Yi Suk-yang's broken, resuscitated pieces of ceramic operates as a self-forming agent that appears to be generating an infinite expansion towards an unexpected fabrication, an assemblage of fictitious loquacity and stuttering discards, suggesting not only that art and waste, the human and the human can coexist, but also that these oppositions may be profoundly, materially, and imaginatively indebted to one another. We turn and are then confronted by Li Bu's larger-than-life, shiny, encrusted monster black. Li's monster black, as if color, right, what its very name, is part of a larger series. It appears at first grotesque, asymmetrical, blobby, full of flesh-like limbs, tendrils, and exposed organs that are explosively congealed, but also seem to be morphing. Crafted from materials often used for women's ornaments, including metal, silicone, resin, chains, crystal beads, and other organic and semi-organic matters, Li Bu's monster dramatizes the complicity between the organic and the inorganic, between art and waste. It too straddles the ambivalence between life and non-life. Its tendrils are congealed, but also seem to be growing, full of animacy, bursting life, a fermentation that's also an arrest. And today on the facade of the Met, you can find Li Bu's continued meditation and next generation of human ornament. That's the sculptures up front. You would be short-sighted to say that Monstrous Beauty offers a feminist or racial corrective to a previous show like the Met, like China Through the Looking Glass. Because as we have just seen through our close look at Li's ceramic dress, to dismiss the latter as mere Orientalism is to silence yet again those objects consigned to display. When we pay attention, capture history or capture objects of history have much to say. The object in China Through the Looking Glass may have reiterated Orientalist desires, but they could also insist on their own historicity, their materiality continually, counterintuitively bearing witness to and documenting the fraught, multiple, and mediated history of transglobal desire and trade and denigration. In short, beyond what the Euro-American makers and users might have intended or silenced, silk and porcelain have their own stories to tell. What Monstrous Beauty does is to make explicit these marginal, unheard narratives behind the lives of objects. The exhibition about 18th century chinoiserie takes risks by choosing some of the more uncanny and disturbing objects, by inserting a living relationship with contemporary art and contemporary social issues, by rethinking the vectors and terms of feminism. It highlights the perilous intimacy between our cherished notion of personhood versus objects of art. What does it mean to be a human ornament? What kind of life can count? What is a woman if her fleshly embodiment resides in aesthetic abstraction? When Iris leads us into the show on chinoiserie by way of Yi Su-kyung's collated fragments, when she puts Patty Chang's video, Melon at a Loss, next to an 18th century silver toilet service with teacups offered as a gift to a woman after their wedding night, when she juxtaposes John Bow's print, The Tea Table, next to Candice Lin's satirical answer to the 18th century print by linking the refined European tea table to the labor behind the tea, the opium, and the sugar alike that enable that civilizational delicacy. And when she poses the fragments of a 16th century shipwreck and Patty Chang's unfinished massage table, itself also destined to be stranded wreckage at the bottom of the Pacific, as the two endings or two beginnings in the circular galleries, she is telescoping the past and the present, revealing their continuities, and doing so, reconfiguring both. She is questioning citationality itself and what it means to revisit. What's at stake is a question of approach. How do we approach a vast history that has produced and continued to produce a great deal of beauty, profit, and violence? What is our relationship to objectification, its jeopardy, its pleasures, and can we begin to be open not only to our complicity in that seduction, but also how a material life might be speaking to us mutely, insistently? Let me end our little genealogy here by returning to Yi Su-kyung's forest at the beginning of my talk. Here, the artist is meditating on the convergence of the organic and the synthetic, giving us a sea of inhuman parts that nonetheless hark back to the specter of the female body parts, even as he registers the loss of that embodied figure. The pieces here, looking like broken ceramic parts in a junkyard, nonetheless also resemble and recall what might be biological female parts. If this were the artist's self-portrait, then it is a portrait that insists on the multitude of fragments. Yi Su-kyung distances herself from the comparison of her work to Japanese kintsugi because she wants to emphasize that her art is not about mending, but about brokenness itself and about underscoring the haunted traces of never complete labor. Her translated vase series, Her translated vase series seems to reference female figures. We imagine we can maybe discern a leg, a hip, a turn of the head, but the material and the title insist that they are things. The idea of women as vessels is, of course, a very old one. And the comparison between Chinese women and the vase is, of course, just as old. In English, we might think of the cringy phrase, she's got a figure like a Ming vase. And in Mandarin, the phrase hua ping, which literally means flower vase, is used in slang pejoratively to refer to women who serve as decorative backgrounds, like a trophy wife. Here, the hua ping, the decorative vessel, has become a once more artful and more resistant, more broken, but also more reassembled. If Beijing number 5 was all about the crisis of history, memory, femininity, and if Li Bu's cyborgs and monsters extend that meditation to their most monstrous and technological ends, then we might think of Yi Su-kyung's deliberately anthropomorphic non-person as a continuation of this conversation. It is as if Li's ceramic woman has suffered an internal explosion, becoming a once more voluptuous and more thing-like, simultaneously more woman and more thing. Yi Su-kyung invokes the history of ceramic as invention and as global commodity. She also references the history of what I call ornamentalism, underscoring Asiatic femininity's paradoxical attribution as excessive organicity and inorganicity, tracking the afterlife and perhaps the weird beauty of survival of Asiatic femininity as an ornament. Here, the repetition and the series that could be part of a minimalist vocabulary has taken on an explosion or an implosion as to produce a decomposition in the very act of formal growth and assemblage. Finally, if the urn or the vessel usually connotes inviting interiority on the one hand and the hollowness of death on the other, think of Keats's Ode to the Grecian Urn, then it is noticeable that Yi Su-kyung's vases and pots and urns here are all sealed, allowing no entry. The feminist theorist Donna Haraway famously said that she'd rather be a cyborg than a goddess, by which she means that she prefers the option of being a postmodern, technologized figure of techno-human hybridity over the reclamation of some naturalized, idealized notion of femininity. But the genealogy of monsters, cyborgs, and other human things that we have been following suggests that, to say the least, that we need something beyond the dyad of cyborg versus goddesses. The history of race and its imagination is thus for me not only one about how persons have been turned into things, but also how things make persons. To attend to the making of a highly artificial, ornamented, and synthetic personhood is to rethink some of our most basic assumptions about freedom and agency, about what constitutes a person and what kind of life can count. So I'm going to end on a series of propositions. I'm going to end on a proposition based on a series of conditionals. One, if the Asian woman in the Western culture imaginary is the cyborg par excellence, that always curious assemblage of fleshly fantasy and projected inanimate objectness. 2, if the cyborg is almost already a monster at heart. 3, if the monstrosity offers us the possibility of art and alternative life, then we must reconsider all the terms preconditioning our understanding of who or what makes the human, the cyborg, or the monster. We would have to, in short, forge a new vocabulary for talking about beauty in a broken world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne, for a really fabulous keynote lecture. I would love to claim that I could sort of summarize all the incredible conversations and discussions and dialogue that we had today, but I probably can't do that in 5 minutes. But I think one idea or thought that has really resonated with me was from the conversation that David and Michele and I shared, which again is this notion of generative discomfort, and that's certainly a part of Anne's talk as well, which is the idea that certain things or images or works of art can create a sense of discomfort, and that's not meant to be to elicit a reaction from you or to shock. I mean, certainly those are elements, but there is a kind of reflective process behind that. And again, to think about, as Anne was saying, maybe we have to rethink the terms of beauty, right? If we can introduce and entertain thoughts of the monstrous as conditioning our notions of what constitutes the beautiful, how might we be able to come up with new terms for thinking about art and for thinking about art's histories as well? So that's sort of my concluding thoughts. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today, a really exciting day, and to all of our wonderful, wonderful participants for joining an incredibly exhilarating conversation. And I hope that you'll continue the conversation. The museum is open late tonight. It's a weekend night, so if you have time, check out Monstrous Beauty and all the many exciting exhibitions open today at the Met. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great afternoon.